The red dust hung thick in the evening air, painting the Colorado sky in hues of blood and fire. Elias Creed pulled back on the reins, bringing his dun mare to a halt at the crest of the hill. Below him stretched the promise he'd spent his entire life savings to purchase 40 acres of tired land, a weathered two-story farmhouse, and the chance to disappear from a world that had taken everything from him. "Almost home, Sadie," he murmured to the horse, though the words tasted strange on his tongue. Home, a concept as foreign to him as peace had been these past 14 years. The setting sun cast long shadows across what was now his property. On paper, it was just an abandoned ranch sold at a suspiciously low price by a man named Samuel Kane, who seemed in an unusual hurry to complete the transaction. 3 weeks of hard riding from Virginia, carrying the burden of memories heavier than his saddlebags, and Elias had finally arrived at his last chance for redemption. But as he urged Sadie down the slope toward the farmhouse, something in the yard stole the breath from his lungs. There, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, hung the unmistakable silhouette of a human body. The years of war had taught Elias to approach danger with cold calculation. He slowed Sadie to a walk, his right hand instinctively moving to the Springfield rifle holstered against his saddle. As he drew closer, the hanging figure came into terrible focus. It was a woman. Impossibly tall, her frame swayed weakly in the evening breeze, legs still kicking in exhausted panic. The rope dug deep into her neck, leaving angry red welts against pale skin. Wheezing, ragged gasps escaped her throat, barely louder than the wind through the cracked walls of the barn. This was no formal execution. There was no crowd, no lawman, no written proclamation. Just a dying woman and a rope on his newly purchased property. Elias felt the familiar coldness settle over him. The same detachment that had allowed him to survive Gettysburg Antietam and a dozen lesser hells during the war. The smart choice would be to turn around, ride back to town, and demand answers from whoever would listen. This wasn't his burden. This wasn't his fight. But then, the woman's eyes found his. Pale blue, wide with pain and desperation. Not hatred, not the fury of battle, but a silent plea that pierced the armor he'd built around what remained of his soul. And in those eyes, Elias saw the ghost of another face. Mary. His 8-year-old daughter, eyes glassy with fever, reaching for him in the delirium of her final hours when he had been hundreds of miles away, fighting for a cause that had long since lost its meaning. "Not this time," he whispered. Before he could reconsider, Elias swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud that sent dust spiraling upward. He moved quickly to the base of the oak, drawing the hunting knife from his belt. With one swift motion, he severed the rope. The woman's body collapsed in a heap, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Elias knelt beside her rough hands, gently turning her onto her back. Her skin burned hot to the touch, each breath coming in short, broken gasps. He pressed weathered fingers to her neck, feeling the faint, faltering pulse beneath. "Still alive," he muttered, unsure if he was speaking to her or to himself. He retrieved his canteen, supporting her head as he trickled water between her cracked lips. After a few tentative sips, a faint moan escaped her. Her eyelids fluttered heavy and slow before opening to reveal those same pale blue eyes, now filled with confusion and lingering panic. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe." The woman was unlike any he had ever seen. She stood nearly 7 feet tall when he helped her to sit up with broad shoulders and arms corded with muscle, not the soft curves of a society woman, but the hard-earned strength of someone who had worked the land. Yet her face, though weathered by sun and hardship, held a youthfulness that suggested she was no more than 30. Her lips moved, and out came a fractured whisper. "Cain sold me, left me." The name hit Elias like a blade to the gut. Samuel Cain, the man who had sold him this land just 3 weeks prior in a transaction that had seemed too rushed, too eager. The price had been surprisingly low, the paperwork hastily arranged. "Samuel Cain?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. "The man who owned this ranch." The woman nodded weakly, her hand moving to her throat, where the rope had cut deep enough to leave what would surely become another scar among the many that already marked her pale skin. He said, "I was payment," she managed, before a fit of coughing overtook her. Elias helped her to her feet, supporting her towering frame as they made their way to the farmhouse. As they crossed the yard, his experienced eyes took in details he had missed in the urgency of the moment. The door to the house had been recently painted. A field to the east showed signs of being half-tilled. The livestock pens, though empty, contained fresh straw. This wasn't an abandoned property at all. Someone, likely this woman, had been working it right until Cain had decided to sell. Inside the house was sparse but not empty. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a bookshelf with a handful of worn volumes, a straw mattress in the corner. Elias helped the woman onto it, then lit the oil lamp hanging from a hook in the ceiling. "What's your name?" he asked, as he poured water from his canteen into a chipped ceramic bowl he found on a shelf. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Nordstrom." Elias tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and dipped it in the water, gently cleaning the wound on her neck. "I'm Elias Creed. It seems we've both been deceived by Samuel Cain." Sarah's eyes fixed on him, wary but no longer panicked. "You bought the farm, every acre, signed and paid for 3 weeks ago." Elias's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Though it seems Cain left out some significant details about the property." As Sarah's breathing steadied, Elias moved to the kitchen area, searching through the sparse furnishings. He found a half-loaf of stale bread and a jar of preserved peaches. Not much, but it would have to do for now. "You need to eat," he said, returning to her side. Sarah accepted the food cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Each movement revealed both strength and the telltale signs of someone accustomed to making herself small, despite her size, a contradiction that spoke volumes about the life she must have led. "Why, hi?" she asked between careful bites. "Why did you cut me down?" Elias looked away, his weathered face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "I've seen too many left to die. Made a promise I wouldn't let it happen again if I could help it." In the silence that followed, the weight of unspoken histories hung between them like the dust in the air. "He sold me to them," Sarah finally said, her voice growing stronger. "To Rollins and his men. Said I was collateral for a debt." Rollins, Elias frowned. The name meant nothing to him. "Raymond Rollins. Works for Judge Harlan in town." Her fingers traced the rope burn on her neck. "They've been after Cain for months. Money, I think. When they came yesterday, Cain offered me instead. Called me a curiosity they could sell to a traveling show." She looked up, her gaze direct, despite the humiliation evident in her voice. "When Rollins said that wasn't enough, Cain, he put the rope around my neck himself. Said I wasn't fully human anyway, so it wasn't murder. Then he rode off." Elias felt a cold anger settle in his gut, the kind he hadn't experienced since the war. "And they left you hanging to die slow." Sarah nodded. "Rollins said they'd come back today to collect my body. Said it would serve as a warning to others who tried to cheat them." Elias stood, moving to the window where the fading light cast long shadows across the yard. The hanging frame still swayed gently in the evening breeze, a grim reminder of what he had interrupted. "I worked this land for 10 years," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Built the barn with my own hands, dug the well when the old one ran dry. Cain said it was my home too." A bitter laugh escaped her. Seems he had other ideas. Elias turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "How did you come to work for Cain in the first place?" Sarah's eyes grew distant. "My parents were Swedish immigrants. Came to Wyoming territory when I was small. I was different from birth. The doctor said something was wrong with my throat, my neck." She gestured to the base of her throat. "Made me grow too tall, too strong. People in town called me names, said I was touched by the devil." She swallowed hard. "When fever took my family, no one would take me in. I was 17 alone. Cain found me working at a farm near Laramie. Offered me a place here. Said my size was a gift for farm work." Her voice hardened. "Later I learned he'd filed papers saying I was his property. Claimed I wasn't fully human, so the emancipation didn't apply." Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard of such things, legal loopholes exploited by those unwilling to accept the end of an era. Those papers wouldn't stand in any proper court. "There's no proper court for someone like me," Sarah replied simply. "Not out here." Before Elias could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats cut through the evening stillness. Sarah tensed her eyes wide with renewed fear. "Rollins," she whispered. "He's come back." Elias moved quickly to the window, peering out at the road leading to the farm. In the fading light he could make out the flicker of torches, still distant, but drawing steadily closer. "How many men does he usually bring?" he asked, his voice calm, despite the tension evident in his posture. "4, sometimes 5, Sarah replied, struggling to rise from the mattress. "You should go. This isn't your fight. Take your horse and stay down." Elias ordered, his tone brooking no argument. He moved to his saddlebags, which he had dropped by the door, and extracted a worn leather pouch. From it, he pulled a Colt Army revolver, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency before tucking it into his belt. "This is my property now," he said, retrieving his Springfield rifle next. "Paid for with every dollar I had to my name. If Rollins has business here, he can discuss it with me." Sarah stared at him, disbelief warring with hope in her expression. "You don't understand what these men are capable of." Elias's eyes met hers, and for a moment the hardened soldier who had survived the bloodiest battles of the war was visible beneath the aging exterior of the man who had sought only peace. "I understand exactly what men are capable of," he replied softly. "Now, stay out of sight." He extinguished the oil lamp with a quick breath, plunging the house into darkness broken only by the faint glow of twilight through the windows. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by the jingle of spurs and the murmur of voices. Elias positioned himself by the window, Springfield at the ready, his breathing steady and controlled. The cold calculation of combat settled over him like a familiar coat, one he had hoped never to wear again, yet fit him as perfectly as it had 14 years ago. Outside, 5 riders emerged from the growing darkness, torches held high as they approached the yard. At their lead rode a tall, gaunt man with a thick beard and a long scar running from his right eye to the corner of his mouth. His black duster caught the torchlight as he reined his horse to a stop before the hanging frame, now empty, save for the severed rope still dangling from the branch. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "Seems our message has been tampered with." He scanned the property, eyes narrowing as they settled on the farmhouse where a faint movement at the window betrayed Elias's presence. "Elias Creed," the man called out the use of his name, sending a chill down Elias's spine. "I know you're in there. Come on out, so we can have a civilized conversation." How did he know his name? Elias remained silent, mind racing. If they knew who he was, then this was no chance encounter. Something deeper was at play. "Don't make this difficult, Creed," the man continued. "We've got business to discuss about property that rightfully belongs to Judge Harlan." Elias felt Sarah's presence behind him, her breathing shallow with fear, despite her attempt to remain silent. "That's Rollins," she confirmed in a whisper. "The one with the scar." Elias nodded, his decision made. Keeping the rifle ready but lowered, he moved to the door. "Stay back," he murmured to Sarah. "If things go wrong, there's a trap door under the rug in the corner. Root cellar, hide there." Before she could protest, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his posture relaxed, but alert, the rifle held casually but ready to be raised in an instant. "This is private property," Elias called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "State your business." Rollins smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Ah, there you are, Captain Creed. Or is it just Mr. these days?" He gestured to the empty hanging frame. "I see you've been making yourself at home. Found our little welcome gift, did you?" Elias's expression remained impassive. "I found a woman being murdered on my land. Decided to object to that." A chuckle rippled through the mounted men, though there was no humor in the sound. "Your land," Rollins repeated, emphasizing the word with mocking incredulity. "Now that's where we seem to have a misunderstanding." He reached into his duster and pulled out a folded document. "You see, Samuel Kane pledged this property as collateral against a significant debt owed to Judge Harlan, a debt that remains unpaid." "I have a deed of sale," Elias countered evenly, "signed by Kane and witnessed by the territorial court." Rollins's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure you do. Kane was always good at producing paperwork when it suited him. But out here, Captain Court papers don't mean a damn thing." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the hard-packed earth. "The only law that matters is whose gun speaks louder." The riders spread out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Elias noted their positions with the tactical eye of a veteran cataloging weapons distances and the quickest path to cover if shooting started. "What is it you want?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, now that's simple," Rollins replied. "Either you pay Kane's debt $5,000, or you turn over the Swedish freak Kane used as partial payment. Or if you're feeling particularly stubborn, we can just kill you and take both." $5,000. More money than Elias had seen in years, more than most men would earn in a lifetime of honest work. "And if I refuse all three options?" Elias asked, his finger resting lightly alongside the trigger guard of his rifle. Rollins's scarred face hardened. "Then we burn this place to the ground, with you in it. But I'm a reasonable man, so I'll give you time to consider. 7 days, Creed." He held up 7 fingers as if speaking to a child. "Either pay up or hand over the woman. And if you're thinking of running, know that there's nowhere in the territory you can hide, where we won't find you." With that, Rollins yanked the reins, turning his horse. 7 days, he repeated. "And just so you know, that freak isn't human. Kane had papers declaring her a rare specimen property, like any mule or ox. You've got no moral high ground to stand on." The riders turned as one and spurred their horses, disappearing into the gathering darkness as quickly as they had come. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Elias lower his rifle his knuckles white around the wooden stock. Behind him, the door creaked open. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, her towering figure silhouetted against the faint light from within. "You should have let me hang," she said quietly. "Now they'll kill you too." Elias turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "They'll try," he replied. Inside, Elias relit the oil lamp, its warm glow chasing away the shadows, but not the tension that filled the small farmhouse. Sarah sat at the wooden table, her large frame making the chair beneath her seem child-sized. "How did they know your name?" she asked. Elias set his rifle against the wall and sank into the chair opposite her. "That's what I'd like to know." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Seems Cain's deception runs deeper than I thought." "What will you do?" Sarah's eyes, still red from the rope's constriction, searched his face. "You can't pay them, and they won't stop coming." Elias was silent for a long moment, weighing options in the methodical way that had kept him alive through years of war and its aftermath. "Tell me everything you know about Rawlins Judge Harlan and their connection to Cain." Sarah straightened slightly. "Judge Howard Harlan is the most powerful man in redemption, owns the bank, controls the court. After the war, he started gathering other former Confederate officers around him, men like Rawlins. They call themselves the Reconstruction Association, but most folks just know them as the Judge's Men. And Cain came here about 12 years ago, always boasted of his connections back east, but I think he was running from something. Started friendly with the judge, did business with him. Then about 2 years ago, things changed. Cain started borrowing heavily from the bank. Gambling debts, I think." She hesitated, then continued. "Last winter, Rawlins started coming around demanding payments. Cain would disappear for days, come back with just enough money to hold them off. But this time," her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. "This time he decided I was worth more to him as payment than as labor." Elias absorbed this information, his mind constructing a picture of the forces aligned against them. "Do you know how much Cain owed exactly?" Sarah shook her head. "He never said. But I found papers once hidden in a box under a floorboard in his room. Banknotes, letters with threats. Thousands of dollars at least." Elias stood and began to pace the floorboards, creaking beneath his weight. $5,000, he muttered. "Might as well be asking for the moon." "You could leave," Sarah suggested again. "Tonight. Take what supplies you can carry and go. This land isn't worth dying for." Elias stopped, turning to face her with an intensity that made her straighten instinctively. "This land is all I have left," he said quietly. "Every dollar, every favor, every promise I could call in went into buying it. There's nowhere left for me to go." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where a folded daguerreotype rested in his inner pocket, the only image he had of Elizabeth and Mary taken before he had ridden off to war. "Besides," he added, his voice softening slightly, "if I left, what would happen to you?" Sarah looked away, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "Why do you care? I'm nothing to you. Just a burden Cain left behind." Elias resumed his seat at the table. "Let me tell you a story, Miss Nordstrom. During the war at Gettysburg, my company was captured after Pickett's charge failed. The Union soldiers were supposed to take us as prisoners, follow the rules of war. Instead, their commander, a man I had actually shared drinks with before the war, ordered my men hanged as traitors." His eyes grew distant with the memory. "I watched 19 good men die that day, strung up from an oak tree, not unlike the one in the yard. I survived only because a Union sergeant recognized me as the man who had spared his brother at Antietam." He refocused on Sarah. When I returned home to Richmond after the surrender, I found my wife and daughter had died of typhoid months earlier. While I was fighting for a cause that was already lost, they died alone. The pain in his voice, though controlled, was palpable. I made a promise then to my daughter's memory, to whatever God might still be listening, that I would never again stand by while someone suffered, if I could prevent it. Sarah's expression softened. I'm sorry about your family. Elias acknowledged her sympathy with a nod. So you see, Miss Nordstrom, this isn't just about the land or the money. It's about keeping the only promise I have left that means anything. In the silence that followed, the weight of their shared predicament settled between them. Two broken souls thrown together by circumstance and the machinations of a man Ipupur who had used them both. What can we do against men like Rollins and Judge Harlan? Sarah finally asked. They own the law here. Elias's jaw set with determination. First, we need to understand exactly what we're facing. Tomorrow, I'll ride into Redemption, see what I can learn about Kane's debt, and these so-called property papers he filed on you. They'll recognize you, Sarah warned. It's too dangerous. Hiding won't solve anything, Elias countered. Besides, if what Rollins says is true, the judge already knows who I am. Better to face this head-on. He stood moving to the window to scan the darkness outside. Tonight, we'll take turns keeping watch. I don't think they'll return so soon, but better safe than sorry. Sarah rose as well, her height all the more impressive as she stood to her full stature. I can take the first watch. I don't need much sleep. Elias studied her for a moment, noting the determination that had replaced the despair in her eyes. Whatever Sarah Nordstrom was, and he was certain she was fully human, regardless of Kane's paperwork, she was no coward. All right, he agreed. Wake me at midnight. And Sarah? He hesitated, then continued more gently. Thank you for telling me the truth. Not many would have been so forthright with a stranger. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You cut me down when you could have ridden away. That makes you different from most men I've known. As Sarah took her position by the window, rifle in hand, Elias stretched out on the worn couch across the room. Sleep would not come easily, but he needed to rest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he would need his wits about him to navigate the dangerous waters of redemption. Just before exhaustion claimed him, Elias's thoughts drifted to the empty hanging frame in the yard. It stood as a grim reminder of how quickly life could be snatched away, and how thin the line between justice and cruelty had become in this harsh land. 7 days. 7 days to find a solution or prepare for war. End of Part 1 continued in Part 2. Retry NOK Next, Part 2, 4002. Edit The Binding Rope, Part 2. Document Dawn broke over redemption, like a hesitant apology, pale light seeping between the buildings that lined its single main street. Elias Creed tied Sadie to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He had left Sarah at the farm with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the Springfield rifle close. The town was just beginning to stir, a shopkeeper sweeping his porch, a pair of women carrying laundry baskets toward the creek, a drunk sleeping off the previous night in the alley beside the Prairie Rose Saloon. Ordinary scenes that somehow felt like an elaborate stage play a veneer of normalcy stretched thin over something rotten beneath. Elias adjusted his worn cavalry hat, hiding the gray in his hair and shadowing his eyes. He wore no gun, openly a calculated risk. Walking into town armed would draw attention. Coming unarmed would make him vulnerable. The compromise was the derringer tucked into his boot, and the knife sheathed against the small of his back. The sheriff's office was a squat, sturdy building of red brick with barred windows and a hand-painted sign that had faded under years of sun and dust. Elias pushed open the door, wincing at the creak of hinges that badly needed oil. Inside the office was sparse but neat. Wanted posters lined one wall, a gun rack stood behind the desk, and two cells with iron bars occupied the back. Both were empty. Behind the desk sat a man who seemed as weathered as the building itself. Thin, white hair combed across a sun-spotted scalp, a mustache yellowed by tobacco, and eyes that retained the sharp alertness of a predator despite the aging body that housed them. "Help you?" the man asked, not rising from his chair. "Looking for Sheriff Miller," Elias replied, remaining near the door. "Found him." The sheriff's gaze sharpened, taking in Elias's appearance with a lawman's practiced assessment. "You're new to redemption." It wasn't a question. Elias Creed bought the old Kane property west of town. Something flickered in Miller's expression, recognition perhaps, or concern. "Heard about that. Didn't expect to see the new owner so soon." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What brings you to my office, Mr. Creed?" Elias took the offered seat, his posture relaxed but alert. "Hoping you might shed some light on a situation I've inherited along with the property." Miller leaned back his chair, creaking in protest. "Let me guess. Visitors last night, tall fellow with a beard and a scar, mentioned something about money owed to Judge Harlan." Elias's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're well informed, Sheriff." A humorless smile crossed Miller's face. "It's a pattern round here. Kane's pulled this same trick 3 times in the past 2 years. Sells property. He's already pledged as collateral pockets, the money disappears. Buyer thinks they've got a deal until Rollins shows up. And you've done nothing to stop it." Elias couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Miller's eyes hardened. "You a lawman, Mr. Creed, ever tried enforcing the law when the judge, the bank, and half the business owners in town are aligned against you?" He leaned forward. "I've got a wife and 3 grandchildren in this town. I pick my battles carefully." Elias studied the older man, recognizing the careful calculation of a survivor. "Tell me about Judge Harlan and Raymond Rollins." Miller glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "Judge Howard Harlan arrived here 10 years ago, right after the war. Distinguished record in the Confederate Army, or so he claims. Started buying up land businesses. Now he owns the bank, the largest cattle ranch in the county, and has the territorial court in his pocket. And Rollins, his enforcer, former lieutenant in the Virginia Cavalry, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as dangerous. Handles problems that can't be solved with legal papers." Miller's expression darkened. 6 men have died by Rollins's hand since I've been sheriff, all ruled justified by the judge's court." Elias absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "What about the woman at Kane's farm, Sarah Nordstrom?" Miller's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The Swedish giant, she's still there." He let out a low whistle. "Thought Kane would have taken her when he ran. She's been his property for years, though how a human being can be property after the emancipation is beyond me." "She's not property," Elias said, his voice tight. "Kane tried to hang her before he left. I cut her down." The sheriff stared at him, shock giving way to a newfound respect. "Well, now that explains Rollins's interest in you. Kane must have promised her to Harlan as part of his debt settlement." He shook his head. "You've stepped into a hornet's nest, Mr. Creed." "So I'm discovering." Elias leaned forward. "What can you tell me about these so-called papers Kane filed declaring her non-human property?" Miller snorted. "Legal fiction. Kane bribed a doctor to claim she had some rare medical condition that made her less than human. Presented it to a friendly judge in Wyoming before bringing her here. It wouldn't stand up in any proper court, but out here. He spread his hands in a gesture of futility. And if I wanted to challenge those papers, you'd need to petition the territorial court in Denver. Miller's expression made it clear what he thought of those chances, which is a 3-week ride assuming Rollins lets you leave town alive. Elias fell silent, weighing options that seemed increasingly limited. "Why did you buy that property, Mr. Creed?" Miller asked suddenly. "Man like you, I can see the soldier in your bearing could have settled anywhere." Elias met the sheriff's gaze. "Wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere to put the war behind me." Miller nodded slowly. "Well, you've found the opposite, I'm afraid. Harlan and his Reconstruction Association have been building power here for years. They don't take kindly to losing what they consider theirs." "Reconstruction Association," Elias echoed. "That's what they call themselves officially. Band of former Confederate officers with dreams of restoring proper order. Most folks just know them as the judge's men." Miller lowered his voice further. "They've been buying up land all through the territory, intimidating settlers, especially those who fought for the Union, or who aren't the right kind of white." The implications settled over Elias like a shroud. Not just corrupt businessmen then, but ideologues with a cause perhaps the most dangerous enemies of all. $5,000, Elias said. "That's what Rollins claims Kane owes." Miller whistled low. "That's steep, even for Kane. Must have been desperate this time." "Is there anyone in town who might know more about Kane's dealings?" "Someone at the bank, perhaps." The sheriff considered this. "Bank manager is Harlan's nephew. Won't help you." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "But Martha Henderson, the senior teller, been there 30 years since before Harlan arrived. Tough old bird. Might know something if she's willing to talk." Elias stood, extending his hand. "Thank you, Sheriff. You've been more helpful than I expected." Miller shook the offered hand, his grip still firm despite his age. "Word of advice, Mr. Creed. Whatever you decide to do, do it quickly. Rollins isn't known for his patience, 7 days notwithstanding." As Elias reached the door, Miller called after him, "And watch yourself at the bank. Walls have ears in this town." The First Bank of Redemption occupied the most imposing building on Main Street, 2 stories of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance, an ostentatious display of prosperity in a town where most buildings were weathered wood. Elias climbed the steps slowly, noting the armed guard who stood at attention beside the entrance, his eyes tracking Elias's approach with open suspicion. Inside, the bank's interior was cool and quiet, the hushed atmosphere of wealth a stark contrast to the dusty street outside. 3 teller windows lined the far wall, only one currently occupied by a young man whose starched collar seemed to be slowly choking him. To the right, a door marked "Thomas Harlan Manager" stood closed. To the left, a heavy iron safe dominated the corner, its polished surface gleaming in the light from the high windows. At the occupied window, Elias waited patiently as the teller finished counting coins for a weathered farmer. "May I help you, sir?" the young man asked, when Elias stepped forward, his tone carrying the careful deference of someone trained to judge a customer's worth by appearance. "I need information about a loan made to Samuel Kane," Elias said directly. "I've purchased his property and discovered there may be liens against it." The teller's eyes widened slightly. I'm not authorized to discuss customer accounts, sir. Perhaps if you spoke with Mr. Harlan—" "Is Mrs. Henderson available?" Elias interrupted, recalling the sheriff's suggestion. Something like alarm flashed across the young man's face. "Mrs. Henderson is occupied with the monthly reconciliation. If you'll wait here, I'll inform Mr. Harlan of your inquiry." Before Elias could object, the teller disappeared through a side door. Through the frosted glass of the manager's office, Elias could see shadows moving, voices too low to make out the words. but the urgency clear in their tone. Instead of waiting, Elias moved to the third teller window, where an elderly woman had appeared. Her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a narrow nose. She was sorting papers with the efficiency of long practice, seemingly oblivious to his presence. "Mrs. Henderson," Elias ventured. The woman looked up, her sharp eyes assessing him over the rims of her spectacles. "Yes?" "My name is Elias Creed. I've purchased Samuel Kane's property, and—" "I know who you are, Mr. Creed," she interrupted, her voice low but clear. "Word travels fast in redemption." She glanced toward the manager's office, then slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. "I believe this might address your concerns." Puzzled Elias took the paper, tucking it into his pocket without examining it. "The church bell rings at 3, Mrs. Henderson said cryptically, then raised her voice to a normal volume. "I'm afraid I cannot help you with account information, sir. Bank policy. You'll need to speak with Mr. Harlan." As if on cue, the manager's door opened and a young man in an immaculate suit emerged. Thomas Harlan bore a striking resemblance to a younger version of the judge, the same patrician features, the same cold eyes, but lacking the gravitas that age and experience confer. "Mr. Creed, I presume," he said, approaching with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I understand you have questions about the Kane property. If you'll join me in my office." Elias glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who had returned to her papers with studied concentration. "Another time, perhaps. I have other business in town today." Harlan's smile tightened. "I strongly recommend we discuss this matter now, Mr. Creed. There seem to be some misunderstandings regarding that property." "No misunderstanding," Elias replied evenly. "I have a deed of sale properly filed. If there are other claims against the property, they should have been disclosed at the time of sale." "Yes? Well, my uncle, that is Judge Harlan, holds certain financial instruments related to that land. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies all parties." "I look forward to that discussion," Elias said, moving toward the door, "after I've had a chance to review all the relevant documents." Thomas Harlan's facade of politeness cracked slightly. "Mr. Creed, I must insist." "Good day, Mr. Harlan." Elias cut him off, tipping his hat before stepping out into the sunlight. He could feel eyes on him as he walked down the street from the bank, from the windows of the general store, from the porch of the hotel, where two well-dressed men interrupted their conversation to watch his progress. The sensation was familiar from his days as a scout, the awareness of being marked, targeted. Only when he reached the relative privacy of the alley beside the livery stable did Elias withdraw the paper Mrs. Henderson had given him. The note was brief, written in a neat, precise hand. "Meet me at the church at 3 o'clock. Come alone. What you seek is not in the bank records." M.H. Elias checked his pocket watch. Nearly noon. 3 hours to wait, and every instinct warned him that lingering in town was dangerous. He needed supplies information and to check on Sarah, but showing too much interest in any of these things could alert Harlan's men to his intentions. The church bell tolled the hour, its resonant chime carrying across the town square. Elias approached the weathered white clapboard building from the rear, taking a circuitous route that allowed him to confirm he wasn't being followed. The church stood slightly apart from the other buildings in town, bordered by a small cemetery where tilting headstones recorded the brief history of redemption and its inhabitants. Inside the church was cool and dim light filtering through simple stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the New Testament. The sanctuary was empty, save for an elderly man in clerical attire polishing the wooden pulpit, and Mrs. Henderson, who sat in the last pew with her hands folded primly in her lap. The clergyman looked up as Elias entered, nodding in acknowledgement. "Welcome to God's house, stranger," he said quietly. "I'm Pastor Collins." "He's with me, Pastor," Mrs. Henderson said, rising. "We'll use the study, if you don't mind." "Of course, Martha." The pastor's kind eyes belied a shrewdness as they assessed Elias. "The Lord brings us allies in unexpected forms, doesn't he?" Before Elias could respond to this cryptic comment, Miss Henderson gestured for him to follow her through a side door into a small book-lined room that smelled of leather paper and pipe tobacco. "We can speak freely here," she said, closing the door behind them. "The pastor is one of the few in town not under Harlan's thumb." "Why are you helping me, Mrs. Henderson?" Elias asked directly. "You're taking a considerable risk." The elderly woman's expression hardened. "Because Samuel Kane isn't the first person Harlan and his associates have destroyed, and you won't be the last, if someone doesn't stand against them." She moved to a worn leather chair, gesturing for Elias to take its companion. "My son fought and died for the Union, Mr. Creed. I will not stand by while men like Harlan try to resurrect the very ideology he gave his life to defeat." Elias sat studying this unexpected ally. "Tell me about Kane's debt to Harlan." "It's not just debt," Mrs. Henderson replied. "It's much worse than that. Kane was part of Harlan's inner circle, the Reconstruction Association. Former Confederate officers and sympathizers with dreams of restoring the natural order, as they call it. Sheriff Miller mentioned the association. Did he tell you what they really are? What they plan?" When Elias shook his head, she continued, her voice lowered despite their privacy. "They're building a political power base, Mr. Creed. Buying land, controlling commerce, intimidating opposition. Harlan has ambitions far beyond being a small-town judge. He's positioning himself for territorial office with an eye toward statehood. What does this have to do with Kane and my property?" "Everything." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward intently. "The association has been systematically acquiring properties along the proposed railroad route. Your land, Kane's former property, sits at a critical juncture where the line must pass. Harlan needs it for his plans to succeed." The pieces began to fall into place. So Kane was working with Harlan, not against him. Initially, yes, but Kane has a weakness for gambling and women. He began embezzling from association funds to cover his debts. When Harlan discovered the theft, Kane fled, but not before selling the farm to you as a final betrayal. And Sarah Nordstrom? Where does she fit into this? Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. The Swedish woman, she was Kane's project. He collected oddities, a man of his perverse intellectual curiosity. He claimed to be conducting scientific observations on her condition, but in truth, he simply enjoyed the power of owning another human being. Disgust churned in Elias's stomach. Sheriff Miller mentioned medical papers declaring her non-human. Fabrications, all of it. Kane bribed a disgraced doctor to create a medical history claiming her condition rendered her a different species. It's nonsense, of course, but it provided a legal fiction that allowed him to circumvent emancipation laws. And Harlan supported this. Harlan supports anything that reinforces the hierarchy he believes in, white men of property at the top, everyone else beneath, some so far beneath, they're not considered fully human. She sighed heavily. When Kane's embezzlement was discovered, offering Sarah to Harlan was his attempt at appeasement. Harlan has unusual tastes in entertainment. The hanging was likely Kane's idea of a dramatic farewell. The thought of what might have happened to Sarah had he not arrived when he did sent a cold rage through Elias. What about the $5,000 Rollins demanded? That would be the amount Kane stole plus Harlan's interest. But it's not really about the money, Mr. Creed. It's about control. Harlan needs that land, and he needs to make an example of anyone who defies him. So paying would be pointless. Precisely. He'd find another reason to come after you. Mrs. Henderson reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded document. This is what you really need to see. Elias accepted the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a map of the county with certain properties marked in red ink. His farm was circled prominently along with a dozen others, forming a clear path from the eastern rail junction to the mountain pass in the west. The association's acquisition targets, Mrs. Henderson explained. I copied this from Harlan's private files. He keeps the originals in a safe at his home. Elias studied the map with a tactician's eye. This is valuable intelligence, Mrs. Henderson, but it doesn't solve my immediate problem. Rollins gave me 7 days to pay or surrender Sarah. That deadline doesn't leave much time for legal maneuvering. The law won't help you here, Mr. Creed. Harlan is the law in redemption. She hesitated, then added more gently, if you're wise, you'll leave. Tonight.
Take the woman and go.
There are places beyond Harlan's reach. Elias carefully refolded the map. I appreciate your candor, Mrs. Henderson, but running isn't an option. That farm represents everything I have left. A sad smile touched her lips. I suspected you might say that. You have the look of a man who's stood his ground before. Once or twice, Elias acknowledged with grim humor. The church bell chimed the half-hour, startling them both. I should return to the bank before my absence is noted, Mrs. Henderson said, rising. Pastor Collins can show you out through the cemetery. Less chance of being observed that way. As they returned to the sanctuary, they found the pastor in conversation with a newcomer, a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and the weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. He fell silent as they approached, eyeing Elias warily. Ah, Martha, Mr. Creed, Pastor Collins said. This is Michael Donovan. He farms north of town and shares our concerns about the association's activities. Donovan nodded curtly. Heard you bought Kane's place. Brave or foolish, depending on how you look at it. Mr. Donovan, Mrs. Henderson said, would you be kind enough to escort me back to the bank? I find I'm in need of a strong arm this afternoon. The farmer offered his arm with unexpected gallantry. Of course, Martha. As they departed, Pastor Collins gestured for Elias to follow him toward the rear of the church. Mr. Donovan isn't the only one watching Harlan's activities with concern, he said quietly. There are others in the community who resist the association's influence. Small farmers mostly. People with little power individually, but who might stand together if given leadership. I'm not looking to lead a resistance, Pastor, Elias said. I just want to keep my farm and ensure Sarah Nordstrom's safety. The clergyman smiled sadly. Sometimes God places us exactly where we're needed, Mr. Creed, regardless of our own plans. He opened a door that led to the cemetery. There's a path through those trees that will take you to the livery stable without being seen from the main street. Go with God, my friend. Elias nodded his thanks and slipped out into the graveyard, moving swiftly between the headstones. As he reached the tree-line movement at the church's front entrance, caught his attention. 3 riders had arrived, Rollins among them, dismounting, with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to deference. Ducking into the shadows of the pines, Elias circled back, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. Through the open church door, he could see Rollins confronting Pastor Collins, their voices too distant to make out the words, but the aggressive posture unmistakable. The pastor stood his ground, one hand resting on his Bible, his expression serene, despite the threat looming before him. After a tense exchange, Rollins spat on the church steps, then remounted and rode off with his companions. Elias waited until they were well away before continuing to the livery stable. Whatever Pastor Collins had said, it had clearly angered Rollins, which suggested the clergyman might indeed be a potential ally worth cultivating. The ride back to the farm was tense, Elias constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit or ambush. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty trail into a shimmer of heat and light that played tricks on the eyes. Twice he detoured from the main path, using the terrain to mask his progress while checking for followers. As the farm came into view, relief washed over him at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that Sarah was still there, still alive. He had half expected to return to smoldering ruins, given what he now knew about Harlan's determination to acquire the property. Sarah emerged from the house as he approached the Springfield rifle held competently in her large hands. She lowered it only when she was certain of his identity. "You're back," she said, the simple statement carrying a wealth of relief. "I was beginning to worry." Elias dismounted, leading Sadie toward the barn. "Any trouble while I was gone?" "No visitors, if that's what you mean." Sarah fell in step beside him. "But I found something you should see." Inside the barn, Sarah led him to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of the largest stall. "I was mucking out. The stalls seemed the least I could do, and noticed the flooring didn't match." She knelt, her strong fingers prying at a section of the wooden floor. It lifted, revealing a trapdoor. "There's a cellar underneath, and it's not empty." Elias crouched beside her, peering into the darkness below. "Did you go down?" Sarah nodded. "It's Kane's hiding place. There are crates, papers, and weapons, Mr. Creed."
Lots of weapons.
The hidden cellar was larger than Elias had expected, extending well beyond the barn's footprint. Sarah lit a lantern, illuminating a space that had clearly been used as a secret storehouse for some time. Wooden crates were stacked against one wall, many bearing military markings. A desk cluttered with papers occupied the center of the room, and a gun rack holding a dozen rifles stood opposite the crates. This is more than personal storage," Elias muttered, examining one of the crates. Inside were ammunition boxes, standard military issue, the kind he had requisitioned countless times during the war. "This is a supply depot." Sarah watched as he moved methodically through the space, cataloging its contents. "For Harlan's Association, appears so." Elias opened another crate, finding it filled with revolvers packed in oiled cloth. "Enough weapons here to arm 20 men, maybe more." "There's something else," Sarah said, moving to the desk. "Letters, records." Kane kept detailed notes on the association's activities. She handed him a leather-bound ledger. "Including this." Elias opened the book, finding page after page of meticulous entries, names, dates, amounts. Financial records, he realized, showing who contributed to the association, where the money went. He flipped to the later pages, where the neat columns gave way to increasingly desperate notations in Kane's hand. "And evidence of his embezzlement. Is it enough to prove what Harlan is doing, to get help from the territorial authorities?" "Maybe," Elias said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But Denver is weeks away, and Rollins will move long before we could return with a marshal." He closed the ledger, tucking it into his saddlebag. "Still, this gives us leverage we didn't have before." He continued searching the cellar, finding maps similar to the one Mrs. Henderson had shown him, correspondence between Harlan and various officials, and most damning of all, detailed plans for intimidating homesteaders who refused to sell their land. Kane was Harlan's record keeper, Elias realized. Probably why he got away with the embezzlement for so long. He controlled the books. "And why Harlan wants this land back so badly," Sarah added. He must know these records are here, or suspect at least. Elias selected several of the most incriminating documents, adding them to his saddlebag. We should move these somewhere safer. If Rollins comes with force, this would be the first place they'd search. They spent the next hour transferring the most valuable documents to a new hiding place beneath the floorboards in the house, then concealing the entrance to the cellar as carefully as they could. By the time they finished, dusk was settling over the farm, painting the landscape in shades of purple and gold. Inside the house, Elias spread the documents on the table, organizing them by type and relevance. Sarah prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, moving around the kitchen with surprising grace, despite her size. "What did you learn in town?" she asked as they ate. Elias recounted his conversations with Sheriff Miller, Mrs. Henderson, and Pastor Collins, watching Sarah's expression shift from concern to anger, and finally to resigned understanding. "So it's as I feared," she said when he finished. "Harlan won't be satisfied with money, or even with me. He wants the land, and will use any pretext to take it." "Yes," Elias agreed grimly. "But now we know why, and knowledge is power. What power do we have against men like Harlan and Rollins? They control the law, the bank, most of the town." "Not everyone," Elias corrected. "There are others who resist Miller, though cautiously. Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Collins, this farmer Donovan, probably more we don't know about yet. And you think they would help us?" "I think they might, if given reason to believe we could succeed where others have failed." Elias tapped the pile of documents. "These provide that reason. Evidence of corruption, conspiracy, illegal intimidation. Enough to ruin Harlan if it reached the right authorities. But as you said, Denver is weeks away." "True, which means our immediate strategy must be to survive long enough to use this evidence." He fixed her with a steady gaze. "Are you willing to fight for this land, Sarah, to stand with me against Rollins when he returns?" Sarah straightened her full height, impressive even when seated. "This land was my home for 10 years, Mr. Creed. I built that barn with my own hands, dug the well when the old one ran dry, planted every tree in the orchard. Cain may have owned the paper, but I poured my sweat and blood into this soil." Her eyes, pale blue in the lamplight, held a fierce determination. "Yes, I will fight for it." Elias nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Then we have 5 days to prepare, and much to do." As if in punctuation to his words, a flaming arrow suddenly crashed through the window, embedding itself in the wooden table between them. The corn husk wrapping around its shaft had been soaked in oil flames, spreading rapidly across the surface. Sarah reacted instantly, grabbing the water bucket and dousing the fire before it could spread. Elias was already at the window, Springfield in hand, scanning the darkness for the archer. A lone rider was silhouetted against the night sky at the edge of the property, too distant for an accurate shot. As Elias watched, the figure raised a hand in mocking salute, then galloped away toward town. When the rider was gone, Elias examined the arrow. A piece of paper had been wrapped around the shaft, protected from the flames by its placement. He unrolled it carefully, reading the message written in a bold, aggressive hand. "This is just the beginning. Creed. Leave now or the next fire won't be so small. R." Sarah read the note over his shoulder, her face pale in the lamplight. "They're not waiting the full 7 days." "No," Elias agreed grimly. "Harlan must suspect what we've found. The timetable has changed." He moved to the door, checking that it was securely barred. "Sleep in shifts tonight. I'll take first watch." As Sarah retreated to prepare for her turn at guard duty, Elias returned to the window, staring out at the vast darkness that surrounded the isolated farmhouse. Somewhere out there, Rawlins and his men were plotting, waiting, preparing for their next move. The flaming arrow was just the opening salvo in what promised to be a relentless campaign to drive them from the land. A lesser man might have considered Mrs. Henderson's advice to flee while they still could. But as Elias checked the Springfield's action and counted his remaining ammunition, he felt a cold resolve settling over him, the same deadly focus that had carried him through the bloodiest battles of the war. He had not survived Gettysburg, and the loss of everything he loved, only to be driven from the one thing he had left. Let Rawlins come. This time, Elias Creed would not be the one to retreat. End of Part 2 continued in Part 3. Retry OK next part. 4002 Edit, The Binding Rope. Part 3. Document. Dawn broke on the third day with the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Elias and Sarah had spent the night in watchful vigilance, trading shifts at the windows with weapons at the ready. The flaming arrow had been merely a warning, but both knew that more substantial threats would follow. Over a sparse breakfast of coffee and hardtack, Elias laid out the day's priorities. We need to fortify the house and barn, create defensive positions, escape routes if needed. Hera nodded, her expression resolute despite the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. I know this land better than anyone. There's a dry creek bed to the north that offers cover all the way to the foothills. And the root cellar under the kitchen connects to a tunnel that comes out behind the old oak. Elias raised an eyebrow. Kane's escape route. He was always a cautious man, paranoid even. A hint of bitter humor touched her lips. Ironic that he never used it when the time came. Elias unfolded the county map he had taken from Kane's hidden cache, studying the terrain surrounding the farm. Show me where these features are. Sarah leaned over the table, her finger tracing the contours of the land with the precision of someone who had walked every inch of it. The creek bed here. The tunnel exit, here by the hanging tree. She faltered slightly at the mention of the oak where she had nearly died. There's also a ridge to the west that provides a good vantage point. Kane used it to watch for visitors. Elias marked each location, his military mind calculating distances, fields of fire, defensible positions. Good. Now we need supplies. Ammunition, food, medical necessities. I'd rather not return to town, but we'll need more than what we have on hand. There's Wilcox's trading post at the crossroads, Sarah suggested, 5 miles east. Not as big as the general store in town, but he carries essentials. And he's no friend of Harlan's. The association tried to force him off his land last year. Can you manage things here while I make the trip? Should be back by midday. Sarah straightened to her full height, an imposing figure even in her simple dress. I've defended this farm from rustlers and wolves while Kane was away gambling. I can handle a few hours alone. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. Keep the Springfield loaded. If Rawlins or his men show up, don't try to fight them alone. Use the tunnel, get to the foothills, and wait for me there. And if you don't come back. Her question was practical, not fearful. Then take the ledgers and documents we found, get to Denver, and find Marshal Reynolds. He served with the Union during the war, but he's a fair man. He'll listen. The practicality of discussing his potential death should have been unsettling, but Elias found it oddly comforting. Sarah Nordstrom was not a woman who required false assurances or protection from harsh realities. She had faced the noose and survived. She would face whatever came next with the same stoic determination. The trading post was a squat, weathered building at the junction of 2 dirt roads surrounded by a cluster of cottonwood trees that provided rare shade in the otherwise exposed landscape. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Wilcox Trading, fair prices, no credit," in faded letters. 3 horses were hitched to the rail outside, and the muted sound of conversation drifted through the open door. Elias approached cautiously, years of combat experience making him acutely aware of potential ambush points. He secured Sadie at the far end of the hitching rail, positioned for a quick departure if needed, and adjusted his coat to ensure easy access to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Inside the trading post was larger than it appeared from the outside shelves, stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, ammunition to fabric. The air smelled of coffee, tobacco, and leather. 3 men stood at the counter, engaged in conversation with a barrel-chested older man who Elias presumed was Wilcox himself. The conversation died as Elias entered 4 pairs of eyes, turning to assess the newcomer. Elias recognized the wariness in their postures, the slight shifting to reveal holstered weapons, the subtle positioning for tactical advantage. These were not ordinary farmers or townspeople. "Help you, stranger?" Wilcox asked, his tone neutral but alert. "Need supplies," Elias replied simply. "Ammunition, coffee, salt, medical necessities." One of the men, a weather-beaten individual with a scar running along his jawline, studied Elias with narrowed eyes. "Your creed, the one who bought Kane's place." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in these parts, especially news of someone foolish enough to challenge Judge Harlan's interests. Elias met the man's gaze steadily. "I am." The tension in the room thickened, hands drifting closer to weapons. "Michael Donovan," the scarred man introduced himself. "We met yesterday, though you might not remember. I was speaking with Pastor Collins when you arrived." Recognition flickered in Elias's memory, the stocky farmer who had escorted Mrs. Henderson back to the bank. "I remember." Donovan gestured to his companions. "This is Jacob Weber and Thomas Erickson. We farm north of town. And this is Isaiah Wilcox, who owns this establishment and also has reason to dislike the good judge and his association." Wilcox snorted. "Reason being, they tried to burn me out last spring when I refused to sell. Would have succeeded if these boys hadn't shown up with buckets and rifles." The introductions didn't ease Elias's caution, but they did provide context. Mrs. Henderson mentioned there were others who resist Harlan's influence. "Few enough," Wilcox acknowledged grimly. "Most folks are either cowed or bought off, but those of us who stand against him watch each other's backs." He began gathering items from behind the counter. "What caliber ammunition do you need?" As Elias listed his requirements, the initial tension gradually eased. The men resumed their conversation, though, in more measured tones, discussing crop conditions and water rights. The ordinary concerns of farmers that nevertheless carried undercurrents of their precarious position against Harlan's expansion. "Heard you've got the Swedish woman with you," Donovan remarked, as Wilcox tallied Elias's purchases. "Sarah Nordstrom." Elias's hand drifted closer to his revolver. "What of it?" "Nothing sinister," Donovan assured him, raising his palms in a placating gesture. "My wife's sister married a Swede. Good people, hard workers. Just wondering if the stories about her are true." "Depends on which stories you've heard," Elias replied cautiously. "That she's built like a bear, strong as an ox, and gentle as a lamb unless provoked." Donovan's expression softened slightly. "My eldest boy took sick 2 winters back. Fever so high the doctor gave up hope. Sarah brought a remedy, some Swedish concoction of herbs and honey. Saved his life." Elias hadn't expected this. She never mentioned it. Wouldn't I expect? Kane forbade her from interacting with neighbors after that. Claimed he didn't want her condition spreading. Donovan spat on the floor in disgust. Truth is, he didn't want people seeing her as human. Harder to treat someone as property when you've looked in their eyes and seen a soul looking back. This aligned with what Elias had observed of Sarah, her intelligence, her dignity, despite years of degradation, her fundamental decency. Cain tried to hang her before he fled, left her for dead. The statement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of shock and anger spreading through the men. "Christ Almighty," Wilcox muttered, crossing himself. "And she survived?" "I cut her down," Elias said simply. "Found her still breathing when I arrived to claim the property." A heavy silence followed, broken finally by Erickson, who had remained quiet until now. "Judge sent Rollins to retrieve her, didn't he? That's why you're stocking up on ammunition." Elias saw no reason to dissemble. "Rollins gave me 7 days to pay Cain's supposed debt or hand over Sarah. That was 2 days ago. But last night, they fired a flaming arrow into the house as a warning. I don't expect they'll wait the full week." The men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Harlan won't stop with Sarah or your farm," Donovan said finally. "You've seen the map, the pattern of acquisitions. Our lands are next on his list." Elias was surprised. "You know about the map?" "Martha Henderson showed us," Weber explained. "We've been tracking the association's movements for months, trying to find a way to stop them before they control the entire county. Which brings us to why we're really here today," Donovan continued. "We've been waiting for the right moment, the right ally to take a stand against Harlan. Someone with experience, courage. Someone like a former Confederate officer who knows how to fight," Erickson added pointedly. Elias stiffened. "How did you—" "Pastor Collins recognized the way you carry yourself," Donovan explained. "Said he ministered to enough soldiers during the war to know the bearing of a commander. And Wilcox here served with the 23rd Virginia. Says he remembers stories of a Captain Creed, whose company was massacred at Gettysburg." Wilcox nodded confirmation. "Different regiment, but word got around. They called you the Ghost Captain after that, the man who survived when his entire unit was hanged as an example." The memories Elias had spent years trying to bury surged forward the oak tree on Seminary Ridge, 19 men with ropes around their necks, the Union colonel's cold order to make an example of the rebels. The helplessness as he watched, bound and beaten, unable to save his men. "That was a lifetime ago," Elias said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I'm just a farmer now." "No such thing as just a farmer out here," Donovan countered. "Every one of us has had to be soldier, doctor, lawman at times, but few have your training, your experience." He leaned forward intently. "We're not asking you to fight our battles for us, Creed. We're offering to stand with you in yours." "Because your fight and ours are the same," Weber added. "If Harlan gets your land, ours are next. If he takes Sarah, who knows who else he'll claim doesn't deserve freedom." Elias considered the offer carefully. These men were not soldiers, despite their determination. Farmers with rifles against Rollins and his experienced gunmen were long odds at best. And yet, what choice did he have? Alone, he and Sarah couldn't hold the farm against a determined assault. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I won't lead men into a fight they can't win. Rollins has at least a dozen experienced guns at his disposal. Harlan has the law on his side, corrupted as it is." "We're not suggesting a direct confrontation," Donovan clarified. "We need to be smarter than that. Use the evidence you found in Cain's hideout, gather more support, force Harlan into the open, where his political ambitions make him vulnerable." Elias was taken aback. "How do you know about Cain's hideout?" A small smile crossed Donovan's weathered face. "Sarah isn't the only one who helped neighbors when Cain wasn't looking. She showed Weber the tunnel last year when his boy got lost during a storm. Said it was a secret, but one worth sharing with those who might need it someday." The revelation shifted Elias's understanding of the situation. Sarah had built connections, a quiet network of trust, despite Kane's restrictions. These weren't just concerned farmers, they were already part of a nascent resistance against Harlan's encroachment. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elias asked. "A meeting tonight," Donovan replied. "At Pastor Collins's church, just after sunset. People you can trust, people with resources, information, influence. Martha Henderson will be there. Sheriff Miller, if he can get away without arousing suspicion." "The church is neutral ground," Wilcox added. "Harlan still maintains a pretense of Christian virtue. Even Rollins won't violate its sanctuary openly." Elias weighed the risks against the potential benefits. A coalition of locals with knowledge of the terrain, the community, and Harlan's operations could be invaluable. But gathering them in one place also created a target, an opportunity for Harlan to eliminate opposition in a single stroke if he learned of the meeting. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "But Sarah stays at the farm. Too dangerous to move her now, with Rollins watching the roads." "Understood," Donovan agreed. "One of us will ride by your place an hour before sunset. If you hang a lantern from the porch, we'll know you're coming and secure the route." As Elias gathered his supplies and prepared to leave, Wilcox pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "Medicine," the trader explained quietly, "for Sarah's neck. Wounds from hanging can fester if not treated properly." The unexpected kindness caught Elias off guard. "Thank you," he managed, tucking the pouch into his saddlebag. "We look after our own out here," Wilcox said simply. "About time someone looked after Sarah." The ride back to the farm was tense, Elias constantly scanning for signs of surveillance or ambush. He took a circuitous route, doubling back several times to ensure he wasn't followed. The weight of the decisions before him pressed down like the relentless sun overhead. Trust these men or stand alone? Attend the meeting or focus solely on defending the farm? Risk everything on a coordinated resistance or make a final stand on his own terms? By the time the farm came into view, Elias had reached no firm conclusion. But the sight that greeted him drove all strategic considerations temporarily from his mind. Sarah stood in the dooryard, engaged in what appeared to be combat training with a pitchfork. Her movements were powerful but unrefined. As she thrust and parried against an imaginary opponent, her tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Sweat darkened her simple cotton dress, and her blonde hair had come loose from its usual severe bun, streaming behind her like a battle flag. She lowered the makeshift weapon when she spotted him, embarrassment briefly crossing her features before she straightened with dignity. "Thought I should practice, just in case." Elias dismounted, leading Sadie toward the barn. "Good initiative, though a pitchfork has limitations in a gunfight." "It's what I know," she replied simply. "Kane never allowed me to touch firearms, said they weren't for creatures like me." The casual cruelty of the statement, delivered without self-pity, struck Elias anew. "Then it's time you learned. But first, let's get these supplies inside." As they unloaded the saddlebags, Elias recounted his encounter at the trading post, watching Sarah's reaction carefully when he mentioned Donovan and the others. "Michael Donovan is a good man," she confirmed. "His son would have died without the medicine my mother taught me to make. And Jacob Weber, he brings me books, sometimes leaves them by the fence post, where Kane wouldn't notice." A faint smile touched her lips. "His wife is Swedish. He thought I might like stories from the old country. They've invited us to a meeting tonight. People who stand against Harlan, planning some kind of coordinated resistance." Sarah paused in her unpacking. "Us? I suggested you stay here, safer that way." Something like disappointment flickered across her face before she nodded in acceptance. "Of course. Practical." Elias studied her for a moment. "You'd prefer to come." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "For 10 years I've been property, a curiosity, a beast of burden, never allowed at a table where decisions are made." She met his gaze directly. "But it's not my choice to make. This is your farm now." The simple statement carried the weight of a lifetime of having choices made, for her freedoms denied. Elias felt a surge of shame at his unthinking perpetuation of the pattern. "No," he said firmly. "It's our decision. You know these people, this land, better than I do. Your insights would be valuable at the meeting. And if Rollins attacks while we're both gone, we'll secure the farm as best we can. Take the most incriminating documents with us, hide the rest." Elias's expression hardened. "Besides, if this coalition can truly stand against Harlan, it's worth the risk." The decision made, they spent the afternoon preparing both for the meeting and for potential trouble in their absence. Elias showed Sarah the basics of loading and firing. The Colt revolver impressed by her quick mastery, despite never having handled firearms before. They concealed the most damaging of Kane's documents in a hidden pocket Elias sewed into his coat and buried the remainder beneath the floorboards of the root cellar. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Elias found himself watching Sarah as she moved about the house, gathering the few personal items she deemed worth taking if they couldn't return. Despite her unusual height and strength, there was a grace to her movements, an economy of motion that spoke of someone accustomed to navigating a world built for smaller people. "What was it like?" he asked suddenly. "Growing up, different." Sarah paused, surprised by the personal question from a man who had revealed so little of himself. "Lonely," she admitted after a moment. "Children can be cruel. Adults crueler still, though they hide it behind pity or false concern." She folded a worn shawl carefully. "But my parents never made me feel like a burden. My father built special furniture to fit my size. My mother altered clothes so I wouldn't have to wear men's garments." "They sound like good people." "The best." A shadow crossed her face. "After they died, I understood what a shelter they had built around me, how much they had protected me from the world's judgment." Elias nodded, thinking of his own daughter, of the world he had hoped to build for her, a world she never got to see. "And Kane, how did he find you?" "I was working at the Hansons' farm near Laramie. Good people, but struggling after losing their sons in the war. Then Kane arrived, so polished and educated." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "He offered them $50 for me, a fortune to people barely surviving. Said he was a man of science, studying rare medical conditions. Promised I'd be treated well, even educated. And they agreed. They had younger children to feed." Sarah's expression showed no resentment. "And Kane was convincing. He could make cruelty sound like kindness, exploitation, like opportunity. Yet you stayed with him for 10 years, never tried to escape." A complicated emotion crossed Sarah's face. "At first I believed him, that I was being given a chance to contribute to medical knowledge, that my condition might help others like me. By the time I understood the truth, he had the papers declaring me non-human property. Where could I go? Who would believe me against a respected landowner?" She met his gaze directly. "And there were times he was not kind, but not cruel either. Allowed me books, decent food. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival." The rationalizations of the powerless Elias thought. He had heard similar from freed slaves after the war, the complex calculations of endurance under oppression. "And then he tried to hang you." "Because I finally defied him," Sarah said quietly. "He ordered me to help bury something I didn't know what at the time. but I found in papers in the package names of people marked for intimidation, or worse. I recognized Weber's name, Donovan's, good people who had shown me kindness when they could. Her hands clenched at the memory. I refused. First time in 10 years. Said I wouldn't be part of hurting innocent folks. And that's when he decided to sell you to Harlan. Sarah nodded. Said if I wasn't going to be useful, I could at least be profitable. When Rollins came to collect, I fought back. That's when Kane put the rope around my neck himself. Said it was fitting a beast dying like a beast. The matter-of-fact recounting of such calculated cruelty stirred a cold rage in Elias's chest. He had seen many atrocities during the war, but there was something particularly vile about the deliberate dehumanization of someone like Sarah, whose only crime was being born different in a world that demanded conformity. He'll pay for that, Elias said, the quiet promise carrying more weight than any shouted oath. Sarah studied him for a moment. You said that's not what you came here for. Peace, not vengeance. Justice isn't vengeance, Elias countered, and sometimes peace can only be built on the foundation of justice served. Before Sarah could respond, the distant sound of an approaching rider drew their attention. Elias moved to the window rifle ready, while Sarah positioned herself by the door, pitchfork in hand. The rider came into view, Jacob Weber, on his sturdy roan, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested a routine visit rather than urgent business. Following Donovan's instructions, Elias hung a lantern from the porch post signaling their intent to attend the meeting. Weber acknowledged the signal with a casual tip of his hat, continuing past the farm as if simply passing by on his way elsewhere. Only someone watching closely would have noticed the subtle nod of approval, the slight adjustment of his course to create a visible trail toward a route that would not be the most direct way to the church. He's marking our path, Elias explained to Sarah. A safer route than the main road. They waited until Weber was well away before making their final preparations. Elias saddled Sadie while Sarah gathered the last essentials into a small pack. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold that belied the tension humming in the air. "Ready?" Elias asked, as Sarah emerged from the house, now dressed in sturdy trousers and a man's shirt that accommodated her frame better than her usual dresses. She nodded, pulling herself onto the sturdy draft horse they had found in Kane's stable, a massive creature that seemed designed for someone of her proportions. "As I'll ever be." They set out just as twilight began to deepen into true darkness, following Weber's subtle trail through a stand of cottonwoods, then along a dry creek bed that provided natural cover from observation. Sarah rode with surprising skill, her posture suggesting long experience in the saddle, despite Kane's restrictions. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Elias reined Sadie to a halt, his senses suddenly alert to danger. Sarah stopped beside him, watching his face in the gathering darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. Elias raised a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the shadowed landscape. Years of scouting had honed his awareness of the subtle signs of ambush. The unnatural stillness, the faint metallic scent of gun oil carried on the breeze, the absence of night birds that should have been calling in the brush. "Back," he murmured, turning Sadie slowly, casually, as if they had simply decided to change direction. "Don't run. Not yet." They had retreated perhaps 50 yards when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust mere inches from Sadie's hooves. Instantly, Elias spurred his mount into a gallop, Sarah following close behind on her larger horse. More shots followed, bullets whizzing past as they raced back toward the creek bed. Elias twisted in the saddle, returning fire with his revolver, aiming not for accuracy, but to force their pursuers to take cover. "The ridge," Sarah called, pointing toward a rocky outcropping that rose above the plain. "We can make a stand there." Elias nodded, understanding the tactical advantage of high ground. They veered toward the ridge, pushing their horses to their limits, as the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. They had nearly reached the base of the ridge when a shot rang out from a different direction ahead of them, not behind. Sarah's horse reared, nearly throwing her, as a bullet grazed its flank. "Ambush!" Elias shouted, wheeling Sadie around to seek another escape route. But more riders emerged from the darkness, encircling them in a tightening noose of men and firearms. "That's far enough, Creed," a familiar voice called out. Raymond Rawlins emerged from the shadows, his scarred face illuminated by the rising moon. "Seems you've decided to ignore my warning." Elias and Sarah pulled their horses to a stop, backs to each other, weapons ready, but hopelessly outnumbered. At least 8 riders surrounded them, rifles and revolvers trained on their position. "We have an appointment in town," Elias replied evenly. "Private business." Rawlins's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, we know all about your appointment at the church. Did you really think you could organize against the judge without us knowing?" He gestured to one of his men. "Patterson here works for Pastor Collins. Tends the grounds, hears things, like plans for secret meetings of troublemakers." The betrayal struck deep. Not Pastor Collins himself, but someone close to him, someone trusted, which meant the entire resistance network might be compromised. "What do you want, Rawlins?" Elias demanded, mind racing through rapidly diminishing options. "Originally, just to deliver a message, a more emphatic reminder that your deadline is approaching." Rawlins's expression hardened. "But now that we know you're plotting with others against the judge's interests, I'm thinking we need to make an example. Something the rest of those farmers will remember when they consider stepping out of line." He gestured to his men, who began to close the circle tighter. "Throw down your weapons, both of you, now." Elias calculated the odds. 8 armed men against his revolver and Sarah's untrained determination. Even if they took down several in the initial exchange, the outcome was inevitable. "If we surrender, what guarantee do we have you won't kill us anyway?" Elias asked, playing for time, seeking any advantage in the darkening landscape. "None at all," Rawlins replied with brutal honesty. "But if you don't, I promise you'll die right here, right now." He aimed his revolver directly at Sarah, starting with the freak. Elias felt, rather than saw Sarah tense behind him, heard the sharp intake of breath that signaled her readiness to charge, to fight, despite the hopeless odds. In that moment, he recognized in her the same quality he had seen in his best soldiers, the willingness to die on their feet, rather than live on their knees. But he had watched good men die needlessly once before. He wouldn't do so again if there was any chance of survival. "Wait," Elias said, raising his free hand. "I have something Harlan wants, something more valuable than the farm or Sarah." Rawlins's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what might that be?" "Kane's records, detailed accounts of the association's activities, financial transactions, plans, names, dates, amounts." Elias kept his voice steady, reasonable. "The kind of evidence that would interest a territorial marshal or an ambitious politician looking to eliminate a rival." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Rawlins's scarred face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Elias reached slowly into his coat, telegraphing his movements to avoid being shot, and withdrew a folded document. "This is just a sample. The rest are hidden, where you'll never find them without my cooperation." Rawlins gestured for one of his men to take the document. The rider approached cautiously, snatching the paper from Elias's hand before retreating to his boss's side. In the tense silence that followed, Rawlins examined the document by the light of a match, his expression darkening as he recognized Kane's handwriting, the incriminating details of an association operation to drive a family from their homestead the previous year. "Where are the rest?" he demanded. "Safe," Elias replied, and they'll stay that way as long as Sarah and I remain unharmed." Rollins considered this, the calculations of risk and reward visible in his cold eyes. "The judge will want to see these papers, and you." He gestured with his revolver. "Both of you will come with us. Now, any trick, any attempt to escape, and you die slowly. Understood?" Elias nodded, lowering his weapon. Behind him he felt Sarah do the same, the fight draining from her posture. "Bind them," Rollins ordered. "Hands only for him, everything for her. I know what she's capable of." And as Rollins's men approached with ropes, Elias caught Sarah's eye, trying to convey reassurance, a promise that this wasn't over. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, a soldier acknowledging a commander's silent order to bide her time. The ropes bit into Elias's wrists, expertly tied to prevent escape, without cutting off circulation, the work of men experienced in handling prisoners. Sarah's bonds were more extensive. Wrists and ankles secured another length of rope around her torso, pinning her arms to her sides. "The giant rides with Patterson," Rollins directed. "Creed with me. If either causes trouble, shoot the other one." As they were separated, mounted on different horses, Elias felt a cold certainty settle over him. They were being taken to Judge Harlan, but not to negotiate. The papers had bought them time, nothing more. Once Harlan had what he wanted, they would be disposed of quietly if the documents proved dangerous enough publicly, if an example was needed. Their only hope lay in the meeting they had been prevented from attending. If Donovan and the others realized they had been ambushed, perhaps a rescue might be attempted. But with their network potentially compromised, caution might prevail over courage. The small cavalcade set off toward town. Elias and Sarah bound and separated their horses, led by Rollins's men. Above them, the moon emerged fully from behind the clouds, illuminating the path with cold, indifferent light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the desperation of their situation. Elias fixed his gaze on Sarah's silhouette ahead of him, her tall figure proud even in captivity. He had promised her freedom, protection. Now they were both prisoners headed toward a confrontation with the architect of the oppression that had defined her life for a decade. If these were to be their final hours, he silently vowed they would not go easily into whatever fate Harlan had planned. They would find a way to escape, to fight, to expose the truth. Or they would die treading with the dignity that no rope or chain could take from them. The road to redemption stretched before them, ironically named for the journey they now undertook. But as Elias had learned in war and its aftermath, redemption rarely came without blood and sacrifice. The only question was whose blood would be shed before this night was through. End of Part 3, continued in Part 4. Retry an OK next. Part for 4000 TU edit. The Binding Rope, Part 4. Document redemption emerged from the darkness like a spectral vision, windows glowing with lamplight, the silhouettes of buildings stark against the night sky. But rather than approaching the town directly, Rollins led their procession on a winding path that skirted the main streets, eventually arriving at an imposing structure set apart from the other buildings. Judge Howard Harlan's residence stood on a low hill overlooking the town, a two-story mansion of red brick and white columns that seemed transported from some southern plantation. Gas lamps illuminated a manicured lawn, and a wrought-iron fence surrounded the property, symbols of wealth and authority in a land where most still struggled for basic necessities. They were taken around to the rear entrance, away from curious eyes. Rollins dismounted, issuing curt orders to his men. "Patterson, take the woman to the cellar. Mason, Richards, secure the perimeter. The rest of you disperse back to town. Check the church, see if our friends decided to hold their meeting anyway." He gripped Elias's arm, hauling him roughly from the saddle. The judge will want to speak with this one personally. Elias caught a final glimpse of Sarah as she was led away, her tall figure dwarfing the man who guided her with a gun pressed to her back. Their eyes met briefly, hers conveying not fear, but a grim determination that matched his own. The interior of Harlan's mansion was a study in calculated opulence. Oriental carpets, oil paintings in gilded frames, furniture carved from rich mahogany. Every element designed to impress, to remind visitors of the vast gulf between the judge's status and their own. Rollins marched Elias through a grand hallway and into what appeared to be a study. Books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes that Elias suspected were selected more for appearance than content. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, behind which sat Judge Howard Harlan himself. The judge was older than Elias had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But his posture remained military straight, and his eyes, pale blue and unnervingly penetrating, held the cold calculation of a man accustomed to power and its exercise. "Captain Elias Creed," Harlan said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Virginia aristocracy. "Or is it just Mr.? These days, I confess, I'm uncertain of the protocol for addressing former officers of a defeated army." Elias remained silent, assessing the man who had orchestrated so much suffering with such casual confidence. Not talkative, understandable given the circumstances, Harlan gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please sit. Despite what you may believe, I'm not uncivilized." "Your hospitality overwhelms me," Elias replied dryly, but took the offered seat. Better to conserve strength to appear cooperative while seeking any advantage. Harlan's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Rollins tells me you've acquired some documents belonging to our mutual acquaintance Samuel Kane. I'd very much like to examine them." "I imagine you would." Elias met the judge's gaze steadily. "Just as I'd very much like assurances regarding my safety and that of Sarah Nordstrom." "The Swedish anomaly." Harlan waved a dismissive hand. "A curious specimen, but hardly worth such concern, though I understand you've developed something of an attachment to her." The casual dehumanization ignited a cold anger in Elias's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've developed an attachment to Justice Judge Harlan, something in short supply in your jurisdiction." "Justice," Harlan repeated, as if sampling an unfamiliar delicacy. "An admirable sentiment, but rather subjective. Wouldn't you agree? What appears just to one man might seem tyrannical to another." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "For instance, I consider it perfectly just to reclaim property fraudulently sold by a thief. You apparently view it as your right to retain said property regardless of prior claims." "The only thief I've encountered is Samuel Kane," Elias countered. "And possibly yourself, if your methods of reclaiming property are as documented in Kane's records." A flash of irritation crossed Harlan's features before his mask of civility resettled. "Yes, these alleged records. Rollins showed me the sample you provided. Interesting, but hardly conclusive of anything beyond Kane's own criminality." He smiled thinly. "Which is why I require the complete set. For justice, you understand. And if I refuse, then things become considerably less civilized." Harlan's smile vanished. "The Swedish woman first. I understand hanging wasn't sufficient last time. Perhaps more creative measures are required." The threat hung in the air between them, its casualness more chilling than any shouted intimidation. Elias had no doubt Harlan would follow through. A man who could orchestrate the systematic oppression of an entire community would hardly balk at torturing two individuals who threatened his plans. "The complete records are hidden," Elias said finally. "Neither you nor Rollins would find them without my cooperation." I assumed as much. Harlan nodded as if pleased by Elias's pragmatism, hence this conversation rather than more direct methods of persuasion. He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he extracted a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. Bourbon. It's from Kentucky. One of the few Union contributions to civilization I've come to appreciate. When Elias didn't respond, Harlan poured a single glass and returned to his seat. I'm prepared to be reasonable, Captain Creed. Return the documents, sign the farm back over to me. I'll even pay you a nominal sum to maintain appearances, and you're free to leave my jurisdiction. The woman remains, of course, but I give you my word, she won't be mistreated beyond what's necessary to ensure her cooperation. Your word, Elias echoed flatly, like the word you gave the farmers whose land you've seized through intimidation and fraud, like the promise of fair treatment for those who've stood against your association. Harlan sipped his bourbon, seemingly unperturbed by the accusation. Politics requires difficult decisions, Captain. The future of this territory, of this nation, hangs in the balance. The war may have ended on paper, but the true struggle continues. His eyes took on a fervent gleam. The natural order must be restored. Men of quality of breeding and vision must retake the reins of power from the mongrel democracy that has brought us to ruin. And there it was, the ideological heart of Harlan's Reconstruction Association laid bare. Not just greed or personal ambition, but a zealot's conviction in the righteousness of hierarchy, of inherent inequality. I fought for the Confederacy, Elias said quietly. I believed in states' rights, in the primacy of local governance over federal dictates. But I never fought for slavery or for the right of men like you to determine who deserves humanity and who doesn't. A fine distinction that history won't remember, Harlan replied dismissively. The cause was larger than any individual's motivations. He leaned forward intently. You're a military man, Captain. You understand strategy, the necessity of sacrifice for the greater victory. What I build here will spread a reclamation of what was lost, a foundation for the future. A future built on extortion and murder. A future built on natural law. Harlan's voice hardened. The strong rule, the weak serve. It's the order of creation itself. Elias studied the man before him, educated, articulate, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. More dangerous than a simple tyrant driven by greed or sadism. Harlan truly believed in his cause, which made him capable of any atrocity in its service. I've met men like you before, Elias said finally. During the war, a Union colonel captured my company after Gettysburg. He gave a speech much like yours before hanging 19 of my men from an oak tree. Called it justice, called it necessary. He believed every word just as you do. Something flickered in Harlan's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the mirror Elias held up to him, but it passed quickly, replaced by cold resolve. A cautionary tale, to be sure, but it changes nothing. He set down his glass with deliberate precision. Dawn approaches, Captain Creed. With it comes a choice. Provide the documents and accept my terms, or watch the Swedish woman hang properly this time before meeting a similar fate yourself. And if I've ensured the documents reach the territorial authorities in the event of my death? A calculated bluff, but one that struck home. Uncertainty crossed Harlan's features momentarily. An empty threat, he decided after a pause. You've had neither time nor opportunity to send messages to Denver. Are you certain? Elias pressed the advantage. Certain enough to risk everything you've built, your political ambitions. The association itself, Harlan's composure slipped further, a vein pulsing at his temple. Rawlins, he called sharply. The door opened immediately, suggesting the enforcer had been listening just outside. "Take Captain Creed to the cellar," Harlan ordered. "Let him see the woman. Perhaps that will clarify his thinking." He fixed Elias with a cold stare. "You have until dawn to reconsider. After that, neither of you will leave this property alive." Rawlins hauled Elias to his feet, shoving him toward the door. As they left the study, Elias caught a final glimpse of Judge Harlan, the mask of civilized authority now fully dropped, revealing the fanatic beneath. The cellar was a stark contrast to the opulence above, stone walls sweating with moisture, the earthen floor packed hard by years of use. A single oil lamp cast wavering shadows across the space, illuminating rows of wine racks, storage crates, and a heavy wooden support beam to which Sarah was bound. They had tied her in a standing position, arms stretched behind her around the beam, head bowed either in exhaustion or to avoid the light that shone directly in her face. An old interrogation technique designed to disorient and intimidate. She looked up as Elias was shoved into the room, relief visible in her eyes, despite the bruise darkening her left cheek. They had struck her then. The knowledge kindled a slow, burning rage in Elias's chest. "Touching reunion," Rawlins sneered, pushing Elias toward a support post opposite Sarah. "Don't get too comfortable. Dawn's only a few hours away." He secured Elias to the post with practiced efficiency, testing the bonds to ensure they were tight without cutting off circulation, the work of a man experienced in keeping prisoners alive for questioning. "The judge is being generous," Rawlins continued, stepping back to admire his handiwork, "giving you time to consider your options. Me, I'd have started with her fingers, worked my way up." He glanced at Sarah with clinical detachment. "Wonder how much pain a freak like her can take before breaking." "Why don't you untie me and find out?" Sarah suggested, her voice steady despite her situation. Rawlins laughed, genuinely amused. "Got spirit, I'll give you that." He moved closer to her, examining her face, as if appraising livestock. "Shame Kane couldn't break you properly. Might have saved everyone a lot of trouble." Without warning, he drove his fist into her stomach. Sarah doubled over as far as her bonds would allow, a grunt of pain escaping her lips. "Leave her alone." Elias strained against his ropes, the fibers cutting into his wrists. "Or what?" Rawlins turned to him, eyebrows raised in mock curiosity. "You'll glare at me more intensely." He delivered another blow to Sarah's ribs, the impact audible in the confined space. This is just a taste of what's coming at Dawn Creed. For both of you." He stepped back, adjusting his gloves with methodical precision. "Think about that while you enjoy your last few hours. The judge wants his documents and his land. Refuse, and I get to show the Swedish giant what real pain feels like before she hangs." He moved toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom. "I'll be back at first light for your answer." The door at the top of the stairs closed with a heavy thud, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding into place. For a moment, silence hung in the cellar, broken only by Sarah's labored breathing as she recovered from Rawlins's assault. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, keeping his voice low in case they were being monitored. "I've had worse," Sarah replied, straightening as much as her bonds would allow. "What about you?" "Unharmed for now." He tested his bindings, finding them expertly tied, but not impossible to escape given time and determination. "Did you see anyone else when they brought you in, Miller Donovan?" Sarah shook her head. "Just Harlan's house staff. They scattered like rabbits when Rawlins arrived with us." She hesitated, then added, "What did the judge want?" "Kane's documents. The farm. You." Elias worked his wrists against the ropes, seeking any weakness. He offered to let me go if I surrendered everything else. You should take the deal, Sarah said quietly. Save yourself. Elias stopped his struggling, meeting her gaze across the dimly lit cellar. That's not going to happen. Why not? It's the rational choice. You barely know me and the farm. This stopped being about the farm the moment I cut you down from that tree, Elias interrupted. Some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed. Some principles once compromised can't be restored. Sarah studied him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. You really mean that? I do. Elias resumed working at his bonds, his voice dropping even lower. Which is why we're going to escape before dawn. How these ropes were tied by men who are good, but not perfect. Elias grimaced as he worked his right hand against the binding. During the war, I was captured 3 times, escaped 3 times. It's a matter of patience, pain tolerance, and finding the weak point in any restraint. Sarah watched him, a new respect in her eyes. Even if we get free of the ropes, we're locked in a cellar with no weapons in the middle of Harlan's compound. One problem at a time, Elias muttered, feeling the rope begin to give slightly. First the bonds, then the door, then we improvise. You make it sound almost reasonable. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The most successful escapes often seem impossible until they're accomplished. His expression sobered. But I won't lie to you, Sarah. The odds are long, and if we fail, we die, she finished simply. I've faced that possibility before. At least this time I won't face it alone. Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of trust, of mutual respect forged in shared danger. No longer merely captor and rescued, nor reluctant allies of convenience, but partners in a desperate gambit for freedom and justice. For the next hour, they worked silently at their bonds, communicating with glances and nods when necessary. Elias made progress, first the ropes around his wrists gradually loosening as he worked them against a rough edge of the post where the wood had splintered with age. Sarah's bonds proved more challenging. Rollins had been thorough aware of her unusual strength, but she possessed an endurance that surprised even Elias, continuing to work methodically at the ropes, despite the strain on her already bruised body. Tell me about Virginia, she said, suddenly breaking the concentrated silence. What was it like before the war? Elias glanced up, momentarily confused by the non sequitur. Then, understanding dawned, she was creating conversation to mask the sounds of their escape efforts from anyone who might be listening at the door. Beautiful, he replied, playing along while continuing to work at his bindings. My family had a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley. Not grand like the big plantations, but good land. Rolling hills, forests, streams clear enough to count the pebbles at the bottom. Sounds peaceful? It was. Memories surfaced that he had long kept buried. My father built the house himself, added to it as the family grew. My mother planted an orchard, apples, pears, cherries. Said a home wasn't complete without fruit trees marking the seasons. You must miss it. Every day, Elias felt the rope give further, his right hand now able to move slightly within the binding. After the war, there was nothing left to go back to. Union troops burned the valley in '64. Scorched earth policy. The house, the barns, the orchard, all ash by the time I returned. Sarah's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry. Ancient history now. Elias deflected, uncomfortable with the direction of his own memories. What about you? You mentioned Sweden. Do you remember it? Not really. I was too young when we left, barely 4 years old, but my mother kept the traditions alive. Celebrated the old holidays, cooked the foods of her childhood. A wistful smile crossed her face. She would sing to me in Swedish every night before bed. Even when I grew too big for her to cradle, she would sit beside me and sing the same lullabies. You could go back, you know, after this is over. Find relatives, reconnect with your roots. Sarah shook her head. America is my home for better or worse. My parents believed in the promise of this country enough to leave everything behind. I won't abandon that dream because of men like Cain and Harlan. The determination in her voice struck a chord in Elias. Here was someone who had endured a decade of captivity and dehumanization, yet still believed in the fundamental promise of freedom and dignity that America represented at its best. It shamed him, who had grown so cynical after the war's devastation and the broken peace that followed. A sudden realization jolted through him. "That's why you stayed," he said quietly. "With Cain, even when you could have run." Sarah's hands stilled their work on the ropes. "What do you mean? You're strong enough to have broken free long ago, smart enough to have escaped. But you stayed because leaving meant surrendering to their definition of you, property, non-human, something to be feared or controlled." She was silent for a long moment, the lamplight casting shadows across her face. "Perhaps," she finally acknowledged, "or perhaps I simply lacked the courage to face a world that had no place for someone like me." "I don't believe that," Elias said with quiet conviction. "Not after seeing you stand tall when Rawlins and his men surrounded us. Not after watching you endure his blows without breaking." Their eyes met across the cellar, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. The sound of the bolt sliding back shattered the moment. Both instantly resumed their positions, pretending to be securely bound as the cellar door creaked open. Footsteps descended the stairs lighter than Rawlins's heavy tread, hesitant rather than confident. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Elias had to suppress a sound of surprise. Martha Henderson stood at the foot of the stairs, a ring of keys in one hand and a small revolver in the other. "Mrs. Henderson," Elias breathed, scarcely believing the evidence of his eyes. "No time for explanations," the elderly woman whispered urgently. "The household is asleep, but the guards change rotation in 20 minutes. She moved quickly to Sarah, unlocking the padlock that secured the chains, reinforcing her ropes. "Can you walk?" Sarah nodded, wincing as the circulation returned to her arms. "Yes." Mrs. Henderson hurried to Elias next, her efficient movements belying her age. "Pastor Collins and the others are waiting with horses half a mile east. When you didn't arrive at the meeting, Michael Donovan guessed what had happened." "How did you get into Harlan's house?" Elias asked as she freed him from the post. A grim smile touched her lips. "I've worked at the bank for 30 years, Mr. Creed. I know where every key in redemption is kept, including the judge's spare set." She pressed the small revolver into his hand. "Only 5 shots, I'm afraid. Make them count." Once freed, Elias helped Sarah remove the last of her bindings. Despite her assurance that she could walk, he noted how she favored her left side. Rawlins's blows had done damage, though her stoicism concealed the extent. "The documents," Elias remembered suddenly. "Harlan will know we had help. He'll retaliate against you, against the others." "Let us worry about that," Mrs. Henderson replied, leading them toward the stairs. "Pastor Collins has already sent a rider to Denver with copies of the papers you showed at the trading post. Not all of Cain's records, but enough to warrant an investigation." The news was both reassuring and concerning. "When did the rider leave?" "Yesterday afternoon. Even if Harlan sends men after him, he has a full day's head start." They reached the top of the stairs where Mrs. Henderson paused, listening intently for any sound from the main house. Satisfied, she opened the door cautiously, revealing a darkened pantry beyond. "Through the kitchen, then the servants' entrance at the rear," she whispered. "The eastern perimeter has only one guard tonight. Most were sent to monitor the church or patrol the town." They moved silently through the sleeping house, every creaking floorboard a potential betrayal, every shadow a possible sentry. Elias kept the revolver ready, his senses hyper-alert to any sign of discovery. The kitchen was dark, save for the banked coals in the large stove casting a faint red glow that barely illuminated their path. Mrs. Henderson guided them with the confidence of someone who had memorized the layout, leading them to a narrow door that presumably opened onto the rear grounds. She paused with her hand on the latch. "Once outside, stay low and follow the hedge line to the eastern fence. There's a gap where the old oak pushed the rails apart in last spring's storm. Harlan's been too preoccupied to order repairs." "You're not coming with us?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "My place is here. I can do more good continuing to gather information than running with you." She met Elias's gaze steadily. "Besides, at my age, midnight escapades are best left to younger folks." Elias clasped her hand briefly. "We'll find a way to protect you and the others when this comes to light." "See that you do," she replied with surprising fierceness. "Too many have suffered under Harlan's rule already. It's time it ended." She opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. "The way is clear. Go quickly." They slipped out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief after the mustiness of the cellar. Crouching low, they made their way along the hedge line, as instructed, every sense strained for signs of pursuit or discovery. The grounds were eerily quiet. Too quiet, Elias's combat instincts warned. A normal guard rotation would include occasional movement, the striking of matches, perhaps low conversation to stay alert during the monotonous night watch. This silence felt deliberate, expectant. "It's too easy," he murmured as they neared the fence line. "Something's wrong." Sarah nodded, her own senses clearly registering the same unnatural stillness. "Trap?" Before Elias could respond, the night exploded into chaos. Lanterns flared to life around them, illuminating the yard in harsh, sudden brightness. Men emerged from concealed positions, rifles and revolvers trained on their position. And stepping from behind the very oak tree that marked their escape route was Raymond Rawlins, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant smile. "Did you really think it would be that simple, Creed?" he called, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent yard. "That we wouldn't be watching our own back door?" Beside him stood Martha Henderson, no longer the determined ally, but a woman clearly terrified, a knife held to her throat by one of Rawlins's men. "I'm sorry," she called, her voice breaking. "They caught me at the cellar door, forced me to play along." "Touching performance, wasn't it?" Rawlins grinned, gesturing for his men to advance. "The judge thought you might have accomplices in town. Seems he was right." Elias raised the revolver, though he knew it was futile against so many. 5 shots, perhaps. 5 men down, if his aim was perfect. And then what? They would still be outnumbered, outgunned, with Mrs. Henderson's life hanging in the balance. "Lower the gun, Creed," Rawlins ordered. "Or the old woman dies first, then the Swedish freak, and finally you, slowly, for the inconvenience you've caused." Time seemed to suspend as Elias weighed impossible options. Surrender meant certain death come dawn. Resistance meant certain death now, and likely for Mrs. Henderson as well. Either way, Harlan won his corruption and tyranny unchallenged. In that frozen moment of decision, Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch conveying solidarity regardless of his choice. They stood together, surrounded but unbroken, their dignity intact even as their freedom slipped away. Then from somewhere beyond the fence line, a single rifle shot shattered the night's stillness. The man holding Mrs. Henderson crumpled the knife, falling harmlessly from his suddenly lifeless hand. Before anyone could react, more shots rang out from the darkness beyond Harlan's property, precise and devastating. 2 of Rawlins's men fell, then a third, the attacks coming from multiple directions with military precision. "Ambush!" Rawlins shouted, diving for cover behind a nearby fountain. "Return fire!" Chaos erupted as Harlan's men shot blindly into the darkness, while their unseen attackers continued their deadly, accurate assault. Elias seized the opportunity, pulling Sarah down behind a stone planter as bullets whistled overhead. "The fence!" he urged, pointing toward the gap where the oak had pushed apart the rails. Now, while they're distracted, they crawled rapidly through the manicured grass, using the confusion and darkness as cover. Elias glanced back once to see Mrs. Henderson also taking advantage of the chaos, slipping away toward the servants' quarters at the side of the house. They reached the fence as the firefight intensified behind them. Elias helped Sarah through the gap, then squeezed through himself, ignoring the sharp pain as a broken rail tore his sleeve and the skin beneath. Beyond the fence waited Michael Donovan, rifle in hand, his weathered face grim in the moonlight. "This way," he whispered, leading them toward a stand of trees where horses waited. "The others will cover our retreat." As they mounted, Elias looked back at Harlan's compound, now a battleground of flashing gunfire and shouted orders. From his elevated position on horseback, he could see that their rescuers were far fewer than the fusillade had suggested, perhaps 5 or 6 men using the darkness and terrain to create the impression of a much larger force. "Weber Erickson and a few others from town," Donovan explained, following his gaze. "Good men with steady hands. They'll break contact once we're clear." They rode hard into the night, away from redemption, away from Harlan's reach, at least temporarily. Elias knew the respite would be brief. By dawn, Rawlins would have a posse assembled and the hunt would begin in earnest. But for now, they had won a small victory, carved out a moment of freedom from seemingly impossible odds. As they rode Sarah beside him on a horse that finally matched her stature, Elias felt something he had not experienced since before the war, hope fragile but undeniable that justice might yet prevail against the forces arrayed against it. The eastern horizon had just begun to lighten when Donovan led them into a narrow canyon following a path that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The trail wound between towering rock formations before opening into a small hidden valley where a cabin stood beside a spring-fed pond. "My grandfather's hunting lodge," Donovan explained as they dismounted. "Not comfortable but secure. Harlan's men won't find it without a guide, and no one in these parts would help them." Inside the cabin was indeed sparse, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and bunks built into the walls. But it offered shelter, water from the spring, and a defensible position if their pursuers somehow tracked them. As they settled in exhaustion, finally overtaking the adrenaline that had sustained them, Elias studied the maps Donovan spread across the table, detailed renderings of the surrounding territory with routes marked in red ink. "Denver is here," Donovan indicated, tracing a path southwest. 3 days' hard ride under normal circumstances, but Rawlins will have men watching the main trails. "Then we don't take the main trails," Elias replied, examining alternative routes through the mountains. "We'll need provisions, fresh horses halfway." "Already arranged. Weber's brother has a place here." Donovan pointed to a spot in the foothills. "He'll have what you need." Sarah joined them at the table, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes clear and determined. "What about the others who helped us, Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Collins?" "The pastor has already left town, supposedly to visit his ailing sister, In Pueblo, Donovan explained, Martha is trickier, too well known to disappear without raising questions. But she has a plan to reach her cousin in Colorado Springs when the time is right. The logistics of escape of survival occupied them until dawn fully broke. Only then, with plans tentatively established, did they allow themselves the luxury of rest. Donovan took the first watch, positioning himself on a rock outcropping that provided a view of the canyon entrance. Elias found himself unable to sleep, despite his exhaustion. He sat by the cabin door, revolver at his side, watching as the morning light transformed the hidden valley. Sarah had finally succumbed to fatigue, her tall frame curled on one of the bunks, her face in repose, looking younger, vulnerable, in a way she would never permit while awake. The events of the past few days, from finding her hanging from that oak tree to their narrow escape from Harlan's compound, replayed in his mind. How quickly life could change, how rapidly purpose could emerge from the ashes of mere survival. For years after the war, he had existed rather than lived, moving from place to place, job to job, seeking nothing beyond temporary shelter and enough work to earn his next meal. The farm was to have been his final destination, a quiet place to see out his remaining years in solitude. Instead, he found himself once again in the midst of conflict, responsible for lives beyond his own, fighting for principles he had thought long buried beneath cynicism and loss. And, surprisingly, he felt more alive than he had in years. The sound of approaching horses shattered his reverie. He was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, moving to wake Sarah and alert Donovan. But the farmer was already hurrying down from his lookout position, his expression not alarmed, but urgently focused. "Riders coming up the canyon," Donovan reported. "One of ours in the lead, but two I don't recognize behind him." "Captured?" Elias asked, checking the revolver's chambers. "Don't think so. No signs of duress, but best to be cautious." They positioned themselves with clear fields of fire covering the cabin's approach. Sarah armed herself with an old Henry rifle Donovan had stored in the cabin, her determination compensating for her limited experience with firearms. The lead rider came into view, Jacob Weber, his horse lathered from hard riding. Behind him followed two strangers, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, wearing a city suit, incongruous with the rugged terrain, and a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of a law enforcement officer. Weber raised his hand in greeting as they approached, indicating all was well. "Brought visitors?" he called as they drew near. "Important ones." The older man dismounted with the stiff movements of someone unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle. Despite his obvious discomfort, he carried himself with dignity and purpose. "Captain Elias Creed," he inquired, addressing Elias directly. "Who's asking?" "Judge William Foster, Federal Circuit Court for the Colorado Territory." The man extended his hand. "And this is Deputy Marshal Thomas Grant. We've ridden from Denver based on some very troubling documents delivered to my office yesterday evening." Elias lowered his weapon, though he maintained a cautious distance. "What documents would those be? Financial records, correspondence, and sworn statements regarding the activities of one Howard Harlan and his so-called Reconstruction Association." Foster's expression was grave. "Allegations of corruption, intimidation, fraud, and conspiracy against the lawful governance of this territory." "Serious charges," Elias acknowledged carefully. "What brings you to this particular canyon in search of me?" "Pastor Collins," Foster replied. "He arrived in Denver last night with copies of Samuel Kane's records and a quite remarkable story about a former Confederate officer and a Swedish woman standing against Harlan's operation." He studied Elias appraisingly. "Though I admit finding you alive is something of a surprise. The pastor feared you might already be dead." The implications slowly registered. Pastor Collins had not fled, as Donovan believed he had ridden for Denver himself, carrying evidence and testimony directly to federal authorities. A bold move that had apparently borne fruit faster than anyone could have anticipated. "Miss Nordstrom?" Foster inquired, looking past Elias to where Sarah stood, rifle still at the ready. "Sarah Nordstrom, yes," she confirmed, stepping forward, but keeping the Henry leveled. Foster's eyes widened slightly at her height, but to his credit, he showed no other reaction to her unusual appearance. "Your situation is of particular concern, Miss Nordstrom. Pastor Collins provided details of your captivity under Samuel Kane and the fraudulent documentation used to justify it." "Is that why you've come?" Elias asked. "To investigate Harlan, to arrest him," Marshal Grant corrected, speaking for the first time. "Judge Foster issued warrants for Harlan Rollins and 7 other members of their association based on the evidence provided. We have a full detachment of federal marshals arriving by train in Redemption this afternoon." The news was almost too perfect to be believed. After days of desperate struggle against seemingly insurmountable odds, to have justice arrive in the form of federal authority seemed like a dream from which Elias might awaken at any moment. "If that's true," he said cautiously, "why seek us out? Why not proceed directly to redemption?" "Because the case against Harlan will be stronger with your testimony," Foster explained. "And because after what you've endured, you deserve to witness justice being served." He smiled thinly. "Consider it an invitation to observe the legal system functioning as it should, rather than as Harlan has perverted it." Sarah lowered her rifle at last, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "And me? What about Kane's papers claiming I'm not human?" "Legally worthless," Foster assured her firmly. "A transparent attempt to circumvent emancipation laws that no legitimate court would recognize. As far as the United States government is concerned, Miss Nordstrom, you are and have always been a free citizen entitled to all rights and protections thereof." The simple declaration, the official recognition of her humanity that had been denied for so long, visibly affected Sarah. She blinked rapidly, turning away to conceal the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her stoic facade. Elias felt his own throat tighten at the significance of the moment. For all the bullets fired and risks taken over the past days, this quiet legal pronouncement represented the true victory they had been fighting for. "When do we leave?" he asked, decision made. "Immediately," Marshal Grant replied. "The train arrives at 2 o'clock. We want to be in position well before then." As they prepared to depart, gathering weapons and supplies for the ride back to Redemption, Elias found a moment alone with Sarah by the spring. She was washing her face, the cool water seeming to revitalize her despite the exhaustion of their ordeal. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. Returning to town, facing Harlan and Rollins again. She straightened to her full height, water droplets catching the morning sun in her blonde hair like tiny diamonds. "I've spent 10 years avoiding their gaze, making myself smaller, less noticeable despite my size." Her blue eyes met his, clear and determined. "I think it's time I stood tall in the light." Elias nodded, understanding completely. This return wasn't just about justice or safety. It was about reclaiming dignity, about standing before those who had sought to diminish her, and showing them they had failed. "Then we ride together," he said simply. As they mounted up to follow Judge Foster and Marshal Grant back toward Redemption, Elias felt the weight of the past, both distant and recent, settling into a new configuration. Not forgotten or abandoned, but somehow balanced by the promise of what might lie ahead. The path back to town would be dangerous. Harlan and Rollins, cornered and desperate, would be at their most lethal. The federal marshals had not yet arrived, and much could happen before justice officially claimed its due. But, as the small party rode out of the hidden valley into the brightness of the new day, Elias found himself welcoming whatever challenges awaited. Some fights were worth the risk, some principles worth defending regardless of cost. And some bonds once formed in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect could never be broken, not by ropes, not by chains, not by all the power corrupt men might wield against them. End of Part 4 continued in Part 5. Retry N, OK next, Part 5, 4002 edit, The Binding Rope, Part 5. Document redemption appeared on the horizon like a mirage wavering in the midday heat. The white steeple of Pastor Collins's church, the red brick of Harlan's bank, the scattered wooden buildings clustered along the dusty main street. From a distance, it looked peaceful, ordinary, giving no hint of the corruption that had festered within its boundaries for years. Judge Foster led their small party off the main trail into a stand of cottonwoods where they paused to finalize their approach. Marshal Grant unfolded a rough map of the town sketching the locations of strategic importance. "The train station is here," he indicated, "on the eastern edge. Our detachment will arrive at exactly 2 o'clock. Deputy Marshal Wilson and 6 men all experienced in handling situations like this." "Assuming they arrive on schedule," Elias cautioned. "Trains in this territory are notoriously unreliable." "Wilson will be there," Grant assured him with quiet confidence. "I've worked with him for 5 years. He's never failed to make a rendezvous." Foster studied the map with a judge's attention to detail. "Our primary concern is preventing violence before the detachment arrives. Harlan must suspect that federal authorities have been alerted by now. A desperate man with his resources could inflict considerable damage in the time remaining. He'll have men watching all approaches to town." Donovan agreed, his farmer's face creased with concern. "And probably at the station itself." Elias considered the tactical situation, drawing on years of military experience. "We need to enter separately, attract minimal attention, gather intelligence on Harlan's movements before committing to any action." "Agreed," Grant nodded. "Judge Foster and I will take rooms at the hotel, presenting as travelers passing through. Legitimate federal officials with no obvious connection to local disputes." "What about us?" Sarah asked, gesturing to herself, Elias, and the farmers. "Too recognizable," Elias replied, before Grant could respond. "Harlan's men will be looking specifically for us. We need a different approach." Donovan grinned, suddenly, an idea lighting his weathered features. "Market day. Every Thursday, farmers from outlying areas bring produce to town. Wagons covered with canvas people coming and going." "Perfect," Elias agreed. "Rawlins's men will be watching for riders, not farmers with vegetables. Weber, can you arrange a wagon?" The farmer nodded. "My cousin has a place just east of town. We can be ready within the hour." As the details came together, Elias noticed Sarah standing slightly apart from the group, her gaze fixed on the distant town with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Not fear precisely, but a complex mixture of emotions too intertwined to name. He moved to join her, standing beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. Sarah shook her head, blonde hair catching the sunlight. "Not about returning. It needs to be done." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "But after, when this is over, what then?" The question caught Elias off guard. In the urgency of escape and the focus on bringing Harlan to justice, he had given little thought to what might follow. The future beyond the immediate crisis had remained an unexamined fog. "I suppose that depends on the outcome," he said finally. "If we succeed, the farm should be legally mine again. free of Harlan's claims. "Your farm," Sarah emphasized gently. "I have no place there, not really. No place anywhere, perhaps." Elias turned to face her, fully surprised by the uncertainty in her voice. This woman, who had endured a decade of captivity, who had fought alongside him against overwhelming odds, suddenly seemed vulnerable in a way he hadn't witnessed before. "You have a place at the farm for as long as you want one," he said firmly. "I thought that was understood." A smile touched her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "As what, Mr. Creed? Your hired help, your charity case. The local curiosity you rescued from the hanging tree." The directness of the question forced Elias to confront assumptions he hadn't realized he was making. What was Sarah to him? No longer a victim he had rescued on impulse, certainly. A comrade in arms, yes, but their battle was nearing its end. A friend, perhaps, though that simple word seemed inadequate for the bond forged through their shared ordeal. "As a partner," he said finally, the word emerging with surprising certainty. "Equal owner, equal say in how the place is run. You built that farm as much as Cain ever did. More, probably." Surprise flickered across Sarah's face, followed by cautious hope. "You would do that, make me a legal partner?" "I would." Elias felt the rightness of the decision settle into place, like the final piece of a puzzle. "The papers can be drawn up as soon as this business with Harlan is concluded." Sarah studied him intently, as if searching for some hidden motive or reservation. Finding none, she straightened to her full, impressive height, a new resolution in her bearing. "Then let's finish this," she said simply. "I have plans for that north field that Cain never would approve." The unexpected shift to practical farming matters startled a laugh from Elias, a rusty sound he scarcely recognized as his own. How long had it been since he had laughed genuinely? Since before the war, perhaps. Since before he had lost everything but the hollow shell of survival. The sound seemed to break some invisible barrier between them. Sarah smiled in return, a real smile this time, reaching her eyes and transforming her face with a warmth that made Elias realize how truly beautiful she was when unburdened by fear or caution. "What are you thinking for the north field?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they rejoined the others. "Alfalfa," she replied without hesitation. "The soil's too alkaline for corn, but alfalfa would thrive. Good fodder crop improves the soil for later planting." Elias nodded, impressed by her agricultural knowledge. "Makes sense. The western pasture could use attention, too." "Irrigation ditches," Sarah agreed. "I started digging them 2 years ago, but Cain ordered me to stop. Said it wasn't worth the investment." As they discussed potential improvements to the farm, a conversation that felt both surreal and grounding, given their current circumstances, Elias realized they were already thinking and planning as partners. The decision had not been charity or impulse, but recognition of a truth already established in practice, if not yet in law. The wagon creaked along the rutted road leading into Redemption, its bed laden with sacks of potatoes, cabbages, and other late-season produce. Weber drove, dressed in the plain homespun of a working farmer, while Donovan sat beside him, a shotgun concealed beneath a worn blanket across their laps. In the back, Elias and Sarah crouched uncomfortably among the vegetables canvas stretched overhead to shield them from both sun and observation. Through small gaps in the covering, they monitored their approach to town, watching for any sign of unusual activity. "Something's wrong," Elias murmured as they passed the first outlying buildings. "Too quiet." Sarah nodded her agreement. Market day should have brought a bustle of activity shoppers, examining produce children running between stalls, the general commerce of a small town in full swing. Instead, the streets were eerily empty, with only a few people hurrying about their business, with the furtive movements of those avoiding attention. "Like everyone's waiting for something to happen," she whispered back. They passed the church, its doors closed despite the traditional Thursday afternoon ladies' auxiliary meeting that Sarah remembered from her years in town. Further along, Wilcox's general store showed signs of hasty closure shutters, drawn a handwritten sign declaring "Inventory Day" hung crookedly on the door. "Weber," Elias called softly to the driver, "circle the square once before stopping. Something's not right." The farmer complied without comment, guiding the wagon in a casual loop that allowed them to survey the entire town center. The bank was open but conspicuously quiet, no customers visible through its large windows. The sheriff's office appeared deserted, though a wisp of smoke from its chimney suggested recent occupation. Most telling of all was the hotel where Judge Foster and Marshal Grant had planned to establish their temporary headquarters. 6 horses stood hitched outside, not the usual mix of travelers' mounts, but matching dark bays with military-style saddles. Harlan's men, without question. "They know," Elias concluded grimly. "Foster and Grant have been made, or they never made it to the hotel at all." Weber guided the wagon to a prearranged position near the livery stable where they could observe both the main street and the train station a quarter-mile beyond. As he set the brake, a young boy darted from the shadows of the alley, approaching the wagon with studied casualness. "Mr. Weber," the child said, his voice pitched low. "Ma says to tell you the strangers are at the judge's house, not by choice." He glanced nervously around before adding, "Sheriff Miller, too, and others." Donovan pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Thank you, Tommy. Tell your ma to stay inside today." The child nodded solemnly and disappeared back into the alley, moving with the natural stealth of youth, accustomed to avoiding adult attention. "Hostages." Elias surmised the tactical situation, clarifying grimly. "Harlan's using Foster and Grant as leverage, probably against the marshals on the incoming train." "Along with Miller, and who knows who else," Donovan added. "Mrs. Henderson, perhaps. Anyone suspected of opposing the association." Sarah shifted among the vegetables, her face set with determination. "We need to free them before the train arrives. Otherwise, Harlan controls the situation regardless of how many marshals come to town." Elias nodded his agreement, mind already formulating and discarding potential approaches. Harlan's residence was formidable brick construction elevated position overlooking the town, likely well guarded under current circumstances. A frontal assault would be suicide, especially with hostages at risk. "We need more information," he decided. "How many guards where the hostages are being held? What Harlan plans for the marshal's arrival?" "I can get that," offered a voice from the shadows of the livery stable. They turned to see Isaiah Wilcox emerging cautiously, a Winchester rifle held low against his leg. "My nephew works in Harlan's stables. Been watching the place all morning." The trader joined them in the shelter of the wagon, his usual hearty manner subdued by the gravity of the situation. 6 men outside, at least 4 more inside. Harlan's in his study with that snake Rawlins. Hostages in the cellar. The federal men, Sheriff Miller, Martha Henderson, and 3 others I didn't recognize. "Guarded?" Elias asked. 2 men at the cellar door, armed with shotguns. Wilcox's expression darkened. "They're not being gentle with the prisoners. Martha was struck when she protested their treatment of the judge." Sarah's hands clenched at this news, her own experience in that cellar still fresh in memory. "What's Harlan planning? Ultimatum to the marshals when they arrive. Hostages for safe passage out of the territory. He has a private car waiting at the station, steam up and ready." "Running," Elias mused, surprised. "I expected him to fight." "Man like Harlan always has contingency plans," Wilcox replied with the cynicism of long experience. Probably has money stashed somewhere beyond reach of U.S. law. Mexico, maybe, or even Europe. But he needs time to escape, Donovan pointed out. The hostages buy him that time. Elias checked his pocket watch. Just past noon, less than 2 hours until the train's scheduled arrival. Not much time to formulate and execute a rescue, especially against a fortified position held by experienced gunmen. We need a diversion, he decided. Something significant enough to draw attention away from the house force Harlan to split his forces. The men fell silent, each contemplating possibilities within their limited resources. It was Sarah who finally broke the thoughtful quiet, her voice steady with certainty. Fire, she said simply. Not the buildings too many innocent people could be hurt, but the lumber yard at the edge of town. Away from residences, but visible from Harlan's house. The association owns it, so Harlan will have to respond. Elias considered the suggestion. The lumber yard was indeed isolated enough to minimize collateral damage, yet valuable enough to demand Harlan's attention. And with the dry conditions of late summer, a fire would spread quickly, creating the substantial diversion they needed. It could work, he acknowledged, but we still need a way into the house itself. Even with a diversion, the remaining guards won't abandon their posts at the cellar. The tunnel, Sarah reminded him. From the old oak to the root cellar. It connects to the main cellar where the hostages are likely held. Wilcox looked confused. What tunnel? Kane's escape route, Elias explained, runs from our farm to Harlan's property, part of their network for moving association members and materials without public notice. You're certain it leads to the main cellar? Donovan asked Sarah. She nodded firmly. Kane showed me once, proud of his engineering. Said it was a direct line to the judge's ear, if ever needed. The entrance on Harlan's end is hidden behind wine racks in the northeast corner. A plan began to crystallize, dangerous, dependent on precise timing, and more than a little luck, but feasible with the resources at hand. Elias outlined it swiftly, assigning roles based on each person's capabilities. Donovan and Weber would create the diversion at the lumber yard, timing it to coincide with a separate distraction by Wilcox at the train station, a supposed telegraph about the marshal's detachment being delayed, which would draw Harlan's attention in multiple directions simultaneously. Meanwhile, Elias and Sarah would use the tunnel to access the cellar, free the hostages, and arm them for the inevitable confrontation with whatever guards remained. If all went according to plan, they would have control of the situation before the train actually arrived, presenting the marshals with Harlan and his men already in custody. And if all doesn't go according to plan, Weber asked the practical farmer, unwilling to leave contingencies unexamined. Then we improvise, Elias replied, with the grim confidence of a soldier who had survived when plans inevitably collapsed under the chaos of combat. But whatever happens, Harlan doesn't leave town a free man. That's non-negotiable. They separated to their assigned tasks, moving with the deliberate casualness of those aware they might be under observation. Elias and Sarah remained in the wagon as Weber drove them out of town, ostensibly returning to his farm after finding the market closed. Once beyond sight of the town, they cut cross-country toward the Creed farm. Still a strange thought to Elias that this place he had owned for mere days, yet fought so hard to defend, now bore his name in his own thinking. The farm appeared untouched since their hasty departure, though Elias approached cautiously, aware that Rawlins might have left men to watch for their return. They circled the property, observing from concealment, before finally approaching the barn, where the tunnel entrance was hidden. No signs of recent activity, Elias noted as they slipped inside. Probably assumed we fled the territory after escaping Harlan's compound. Tra moved to the largest stall, kneeling to activate the hidden mechanism that revealed the trapdoor. The hinges protested slightly from disuse, as she lifted the heavy wooden panel, exposing the dark passage below. "Not exactly made for someone my size," she remarked wryly, eyeing the narrow opening. "But I managed before. I'll manage again." They descended into darkness, lighting a small bullseye lantern once the trapdoor was closed behind them. The tunnel was exactly as Sarah had described, a crude but effective passage shored up with timber supports every few yards, its earthen floor packed hard by years of use. It extended straight ahead, sloping gradually downward in the direction of town. "How long will it take to reach Harlan's cellar?" Elias asked, as they began their journey, keeping his voice low despite being underground. 20 minutes, perhaps, Sarah estimated. Longer with only one lantern. Kane always kept it well-maintained, feared cave-ins. They moved as quickly as the confined space, and limited light allowed each step, bringing them closer to what could well be a fatal confrontation. Neither spoke much, conserving breath and focus for the challenges ahead. But in the close confines of the tunnel, their shoulders occasionally brushed silent reminders that neither faced the danger alone. At one point, the passage narrowed significantly, requiring Sarah to crouch uncomfortably, her unusual height a liability in the restricted space. Without comment, Elias took the lead, holding the lantern higher to illuminate the way ahead while she navigated the difficult section. The simple courtesy treating her difficulty as a practical matter, requiring adjustment rather than a peculiarity to be remarked upon, affected Sarah more deeply than any grand gesture could have. For so long, her physical differences had been the primary way others defined her, as spectacle, as freak, as something less than fully human. Elias's matter-of-fact acceptance of her as she was, with strengths and limitations like any other person, represented a form of respect she had rarely experienced. The tunnel eventually widened again, the packed earth giving way to stone steps as they neared Harlan's property. Elias extinguished the lantern as they approached what appeared to be a dead end, but which Sarah identified as the concealed entrance to the wine cellar. "There's a release mechanism," she whispered, feeling along the rough stone wall. "Here this stone pivots." She pressed against a particular rock, and a section of the wall swung inward with surprising silence, revealing the edge of wooden wine racks beyond. They listened intently for any sound that might indicate guards in the immediate vicinity. Hearing nothing, Elias eased through the opening, Sarah following close behind. They found themselves in a well-stocked wine cellar dimly lit by a single wall sconce. Beyond a heavy oak door, voices could be heard, the low murmur of conversation punctuated by occasional sharp commands. Elias moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the wood to better discern what was happening in the main cellar beyond. Sarah positioned herself beside him, her expression tense but resolute. 2 guards, Elias breathed, barely audible. Complaining about being stuck with babysitting duty while others prepare for the marshal's arrival. Sarah nodded her understanding. Hostages, can't tell, must be in a separate section. He eased back from the door, considering their options. We need to take the guards quietly. Any noise will alert those upstairs. They formulated a swift plan, using gestures more than whispers. Sarah would create a distraction, a sound from within the wine cellar that would draw at least one guard to investigate. Elias would ambush him, then use the captured weapon to subdue the second guard. Simple in theory. Considerably more dangerous in execution, especially if the guards proved more cautious than their bored conversation suggested. Sarah selected a wine bottle from a nearby rack, nodding to Elias to indicate her readiness. He positioned himself beside the door, the hunting knife he had carried since leaving Virginia, held ready in his right hand. With deliberate care, Sarah dropped the bottle. The crash of breaking glass and splashing liquid echoed in the confined space, subtle enough to avoid alerting the entire household, but sufficiently alarming to demand investigation from those nearby. "What the hell was that?" a voice demanded from beyond the door. "Probably another rat," a second voice replied. "Place is infested. Check it out while I watch the prisoners." Footsteps approached the wine cellar door. Elias' tensed knife poised as the latch lifted, and the door began to swing inward. A bearded man with a shotgun stepped cautiously into the doorway, squinting into the dimness. "Don't see no," was all he managed, before Elias struck, clamping one hand over the guard's mouth, while the knife found the vulnerable spot beneath his jaw. A sharp thrust, a muffled gurgle, and the man sagged in Elias's grasp, dead, before he fully comprehended the danger. Sarah caught the falling shotgun before it could clatter to the floor, handling the weapon with more confidence than she had shown during their brief firearms practice at the farm. Elias dragged the body fully into the wine cellar out of sight from the main room, then took position at the door once more. "Jenkins," the second guard called after a moment. "You fall in a wine barrel or something." When no answer came, they heard a muttered curse followed by approaching footsteps. The second guard was more cautious, shotgun raised, as he appeared in the doorway. "Jenkins, I swear to Christ!" His eyes widened as he registered the empty cellar, his companion nowhere in sight. That moment of confusion was all Elias needed. He struck from behind the door knife, finding the guard's throat, in a swift, practiced motion that spoke of battlefield experience rather than frontier justice. The man died without raising the alarm, his body caught by Sarah before it could hit the floor with betraying noise. "Clear," Elias whispered, retrieving the second shotgun and checking its load. "Let's find the hostages." The main cellar was larger than they had anticipated, divided into several sections by brick partition walls. In the farthest corner, behind a heavy iron-barred door that reminded Elias uncomfortably of a jail cell, they found the hostages. Judge Foster sat on a rough wooden bench, his distinguished appearance marred by a bruised cheek and torn jacket. Beside him, Marshal Grant stood at alert, despite a makeshift bandage wrapped around his forearm, evidence of resistance during their capture. Sheriff Miller leaned against the far wall, his face a map of fresh bruises, while Mrs. Henderson tended to two other men Elias didn't recognize, likely townspeople who had opposed Harlan's schemes. "Mr. Creed," Foster exclaimed in a harsh whisper as they approached the cell. "Miss Nordstrom, how did you—" "No time to explain." Elias cut him off, examining the cell door. It was secured by a heavy padlock, the key undoubtedly carried by one of the guards now lying dead in the wine cellar. "Stand back from the door." He positioned the shotgun's barrel directly against the padlock, angling it to direct the blast away from the occupants. The risk of noise was unavoidable. Now they would have minutes at most, once the lock was shattered, before Harlan's remaining men investigated. "Ready?" he asked Sarah, who nodded, and braced the second shotgun against her shoulder, aimed at the cellar stairs in case reinforcements appeared. Elias fired. The blast in the confined space was deafening, but effective. The padlock disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments. He yanked the door open, gesturing urgently for the prisoners to exit. "Harlan's men will have heard that," he warned as Foster helped Mrs. Henderson to her feet. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they come to investigate." "There are at least 10 more upstairs," Marshal Grant informed him, accepting the shotgun Elias offered. "Armed and expecting trouble from the arriving marshals." "Not just from the marshals," Sarah replied grimly. "Donovan and the others should be creating diversions by now. With luck, some of Harlan's force will be drawn away." Sheriff Miller straightened painfully, his lawman's instincts clearly assessing their tactical situation. "Back exit through the wine cellar." "Tunnel leads to our farm," Elias confirmed. but it's narrow, slow, going for this many people. We might not all make it before they secure the cellar." Judge Foster's expression hardened with uncharacteristic martial resolve. "Then we make our stand here. The high ground of the stairs provides a defensible position. If we can hold until the marshal's detachment arrives—" A sudden explosion from somewhere in town interrupted him, the first diversion beginning right on schedule. Moments later, shouts erupted from the floor above, followed by the thunder of boots as men rushed to respond. "That's our cue," Elias decided. "Judge Mrs. Henderson and the injured men take the tunnel. Marshal Sheriff Sarah and I will hold the stairs as long as possible, then follow if we can." "I should stay and fight," Foster protested. "With respect, Your Honor, you're more valuable alive than dead," Grant countered firmly. "The territorial court needs you to ensure Harlan faces justice if we succeed. And if we fail, you're the only one who knows the full extent of his crimes." The logic was impeccable, and Foster reluctantly conceded. Mrs. Henderson led him and the other civilians toward the wine cellar entrance, her practical efficiency a welcome counterpoint to the confusion of the moment. As they disappeared into the tunnel, Elias, Sarah Grant, and Miller took up positions at the base of the cellar stairs, using barrels and crates as makeshift cover. They had 3 shotguns, and Elias's revolver between them limited ammunition against superior numbers, but the narrow staircase would funnel attackers into their field of fire, partially neutralizing the disadvantage. "Just like Thermopylae," Grant remarked with grim humor as they settled into position. "Let's hope for a better outcome than the Spartans had," Miller replied dryly. A second explosion rocked the house closer, this time Wilcox's contribution at the train station most likely. More shouting from above, the distinct sound of Rawlins bellowing orders over the confusion. Then footsteps on the stairs, cautious but determined. A voice called down, "Jenkins Malone, report?" When no answer came, a shot was fired blindly into the cellar. A probing gesture meant to provoke return fire that would reveal their positions. The 4 defenders remained silent weapons trained on the staircase. "Cellar's compromised," the voice shouted back up to unseen commanders. "Prisoners loose!" The next moments unfolded in a blur of violence as 3 of Harlan's men charged down the stairs, guns blazing. Elias and Grant fired simultaneously, the twin blasts of their shotguns devastating in the confined space. 2 attackers fell immediately, the third staggering back up the stairs wounded but alive to report the strength of the resistance. "Reload!" Elias ordered, breaking open his shotgun to insert fresh shells. "They'll come in force next time." Sarah handed spare ammunition to Miller, her height allowing her to see over their barricade more easily than the others. "Movement at the top of the stairs," she reported. "At least 4 men." "They'll try to rush us," Grant predicted. "Overwhelm with numbers what they can't overcome with caution." Elias nodded his agreement. "When they come, aim low. Wound rather than kill if possible. Better odds in a courtroom later if we're not responsible for a massacre." The lawmen exchanged glances, seemingly reassessing their opinion of the former Confederate officer who now advocated restraint. But before either could respond, a new commotion erupted above, not the expected assault, but shouts of alarm and the crack of rifles fired in a different part of the house. "What the hell?" Miller muttered, confusion evident in his voice. A tremendous crash shook the ceiling, followed by the distinctive sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. More gunfire, more shouting, but not directed at the cellar defenders. "The marshals," Grant realized, hope lighting his features. "They must have arrived early, or—" "Donovan and the others," Sarah corrected, a fierce smile transforming her face. "They were supposed to create a diversion, but it sounds like they've mounted a full assault. Footsteps thundered overhead as Harlan's men repositioned to meet this unexpected threat, momentarily forgetting the cellar and its occupants. Elias recognized the tactical opportunity immediately. "Up the stairs," he ordered. "Now, while they're distracted, we take them from behind." They ascended swiftly, Sarah in the lead, with her superior height, providing the best field of vision, followed by Elias, Grant, and Miller, bringing up the rear. At the top of the stairs, they emerged into the kitchen, now deserted, as Harlan's defenders concentrated their efforts at the front of the house. Through windows and doorways, they glimpsed an extraordinary scene unfolding in the mansion's grand entrance hall. Donovan Weber, Wilcox, and at least a dozen other townspeople, shopkeepers, farmers, ordinary citizens who had suffered under Harlan's regime, had mounted an impromptu uprising armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and in some cases, simple farm implements. What they lacked in military training they made up for in numbers and righteous fury. Harlan's men were professional gunfighters, but they were outnumbered and caught by surprise, a fatal combination, even for experienced combatants. "Circle around," Elias directed his small group. "Cut off their retreat through the study. That's where Harlan and Rawlins will be." They moved through the house's rear corridors, the sounds of battle growing more intense as Harlan's defenders fell back toward their employer's inner sanctum. Twice they encountered stragglers, men seeking alternate escape routes, who surrendered quickly when confronted with 4 determined adversaries and no clear path to freedom. Finally, they reached the study door, a massive oak panel carved with the Harlan family crest, a pretentious touch that seemed especially hollow now as the judge's empire crumbled around him. From within came the sound of agitated voices, Harlan's cultured tones sharpened by panic, Rawlins's gruffer responses laden with curses. "Don't care how, just hold them off long enough for us to reach the station. With what men most are dead or captured by now. And that mob of farmers, then shoot your way out. That's what I pay you for, isn't it? Kill them all, if necessary." Elias positioned his companions on either side of the door, then stepped back, raising his boot to deliver a powerful kick just beside the latch. The door burst inward with a splintering crack, revealing Judge Howard Harlan behind his massive desk, frantically stuffing papers into a leather satchel, while Raymond Rawlins stood at the window, revolver in hand, assessing potential escape routes. Both men froze at the intrusion, expressions shifting from surprise to cold calculation as they registered who had cornered them. "It's over, Judge," Elias stated flatly, shotgun leveled at Harlan's chest. "Your men are defeated. The marshals will be here any minute. There's nowhere left to run." Harlan's aristocratic features contorted with contempt. "You think this changes anything? Captain Creed, men like me are never truly defeated. There will be hearings, inquiries, legal maneuverings your simple military mind cannot begin to comprehend. I have friends in Denver, in Washington itself. This unpleasantness is temporary at best." "Maybe," Sarah replied, stepping forward to stand beside Elias. "But you'll face it from a cell, not a judge's bench. And every person you've wronged will have their day in court, including me." Rawlins's scarred face twisted in a snarl, his revolver shifting to target Sarah. "Always did want to put you down properly, freak. Should have done it years ago when Kane first brought you to town." Before he could fire, multiple weapons trained on him, not just from Elias and the lawmen, but from the doorway behind them, where Donovan and several townspeople now stood, faces grim with the determination of those who had suffered too much and would endure no more. Seeing himself comprehensively outgunned, Rawlins slowly lowered his weapon. "Your move, Judge," he said, voice heavy with the recognition of defeat. For a moment, it seemed Harlan might surrender with what dignity remained to him. But as Marshal Grant stepped forward to formally arrest him, the judge's hand darted to a desk drawer, emerging with a small derringer, a last desperate gambit from a man unaccustomed to losing. "I will not be judged by my inferiors," he snarled, aiming not at his captors but at Sarah, a final vindictive strike at the woman whose very existence challenged his beliefs about natural hierarchy and proper order. Multiple shots rang out simultaneously. Harlan staggered back, his expression one of almost comical surprise, as blood blossomed across his immaculate white shirt. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as he collapsed behind his desk dead before he hit the floor. In the ringing silence that followed, it was impossible to determine whose bullet had found its mark. Elias Grant Miller, and several townspeople had fired in the same instant. Perhaps it was better that way, Elias thought. No single executioner, but a community defending one of its own against a tyrant's final act of malice. Rawlins, witnessing his employer's death, made the wise decision to place his revolver carefully on the floor, raising his hands in unambiguous surrender. Marshal Grant moved forward to secure him, reciting the formal charges with the solemnity of a man who understood that justice, while necessary, brought little joy when delivered through violence. As the adrenaline of combat faded, Elias became aware of the scene beyond the study. Throughout the house, Harlan's remaining men were surrendering to the improvised citizen militia. From outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of a train whistle, the marshal's detachment arriving exactly on schedule, though their services were now required for peacekeeping rather than combat. Sarah stood motionless beside him, her gaze fixed on Harlan's body with an expression Elias couldn't quite interpret, not triumph or satisfaction, but something more complex, a recognition, perhaps, that a significant chapter of her life had closed, leaving the future unwritten before her. "It's finished," he said quietly, just for her ears. She turned to him, blue eyes luminous with emotions too profound for simple naming. "No," she replied with gentle certainty. "It's just beginning." 3 weeks later, Elias stood on the porch of the farmhouse watching as Sarah directed the placement of new fence posts along the western boundary. True to her word, she had begun implementing improvements almost immediately after their return, the north field already plowed for alfalfa irrigation ditches, reopened, and extended repairs to outbuildings well underway. The official paperwork recognizing her as equal partner in the farm's ownership had been the first order of business upon their return to redemption after Harlan's death. Judge Foster had personally overseen the documentation, ensuring no future legal challenges could threaten Sarah's status as a free citizen and property owner. Rawlins and 17 surviving members of the association now awaited trial in Denver, their eventual conviction virtually assured given the mountain of evidence recovered from Harlan's records. Samuel Kane remained at large, though Marshal Grant had promised that federal authorities would continue the search indefinitely. Justice, while incomplete, had at least begun its work. In town, changes were already visible. Sheriff Miller, freed from Harlan's influence, had appointed Michael Donovan as his deputy, an unconventional choice that nonetheless reflected the new spirit of cooperation between townspeople and outlying farmers. Martha Henderson had assumed temporary management of the bank until a permanent replacement could be found, her decades of experience finally receiving proper recognition. Pastor Collins had returned from Denver to resume his duties at the church, where attendance had swelled as the community sought to rebuild its spiritual foundations alongside its civic ones. His sermons now frequently addressed themes of justice and equality that would have been dangerous under Harlan's regime, a small but significant measure of the freedom that had been reclaimed. As for the farm itself, progress was visible in every direction. The hanging tree, that grim reminder of how their paths had first crossed, had been cut down, its wood, repurposed for support beams in the new barn rising behind the house. Symbolism that might have seemed heavy-handed in literature, but felt appropriate in the flesh-and-blood reality of their shared experience. Sarah approached the porch, wiping sweat from her brow with a kerchief. Despite the physical labor, she moved with a new lightness, unburdened by the constant vigilance and submission that had characterized her years under Kane's control. "The western fence should be finished by sundown," she reported, accepting the cup of water Elias offered. "Weber's bringing additional lumber tomorrow for the barn roof." "You're working too hard," Elias observed, though without real criticism. "The farm won't be rebuilt in a day." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that still caught him by surprise. 10 years of someone else deciding what I could build, what I could create. Forgive me if I'm eager to make up for lost time." "Nothing to forgive," he assured her, returning the smile with one of his own, a gesture that came more naturally to him with each passing day. "I just don't want you exhausting yourself before we've properly begun." The casual "we" hung in the air between them, weighted with significance, beyond the business partnership formalized in legal documents. Over the weeks since their return, something had shifted gradually in their relationship, moving beyond the bonds forged in shared danger to something quieter but no less profound. They had not discussed it directly, both perhaps wary of disturbing the delicate evolution of feelings neither had expected to experience again. Elias, widowed and hardened by war, had believed himself incapable of such emotions. Sarah, defined for so long by her differences, rather than her humanity, had never dared hope for the simple dignity of being seen and valued as a woman, rather than a curiosity. "I was thinking," Sarah said, after a comfortable silence, "about expanding the orchard next spring. Your mother's approach, marking the seasons with fruit trees, seems wise." The reference to his earlier story, shared in the darkness of Harlan's cellar as they worked to escape their bonds, touched Elias deeply. That she had remembered such a detail, incorporated it into her vision for their shared future, spoke volumes about the attention she paid to his words, his history, his heart. "I'd like that," he replied simply. "Apple trees take 5 years to bear proper fruit, you know. It's a commitment to the future." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said, holding his gaze steadily. "Are you?" "No." Elias answered the single syllable carrying the weight of promise. "This is home now." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the land in gold and amber, they remained on the porch, shoulders occasionally brushing, as they discussed the next day's work. Beyond the boundaries of their farm, redemption was finding its way toward a more just future. Beyond that, the territory and nation continued their own complicated journey of reconstruction and reconciliation. But here on this small patch of hard-won earth, two people who had known profound loss and suffering had found something neither had dared expect, not just survival or justice, but the chance to build something meaningful together. A partnership forged initially by a rope that had nearly ended a life now bound by choices freely made and mutual respect hard-earned. The hanging frame that had once dominated the yard was gone, its grim purpose erased from the landscape, if not from memory. In its place stood the beginnings of a home imperfect, unfinished, but founded on the radical proposition that every person, regardless of origin or appearance or past, deserved dignity, freedom, and the opportunity to determine their own story. That evening, as darkness settled over the farm and Sarah lit the lamps inside, Elias remained on the porch a moment longer, contemplating the stars emerging in the vast Colorado sky. For the first time since before the war, he felt the weight of the past balanced by hope, for the future not erased or forgotten, but carried now with shoulders strengthened by shared purpose and unexpected grace. The binding rope, that had nearly claimed Sarah's life had been transformed first into the bonds of mutual survival, then partnership, and now something deeper still. Not a noose, but a lifeline connecting two damaged souls who had found in each other not just redemption, but the promise of a future neither could have imagined alone. Some ties once formed could never be broken, and some, despite beginning in darkness and pain, could lead eventually to light, the ends.